Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. When I was younger, maybe around 14 or 15, my family used to camp a lot. Mostly in state parks nearby, places we could drive to in just a few hours. We had this big green tent we always used, the same spot year after year, surrounded by woods and with a decent trail that looped through the trees and down to a little creek. It was the kind of place where you could still see stars at night, where the campfires actually felt necessary and not just like decoration. The whole place smelled like pine needles and dirt and would smoke. Every summer we came back, and it always felt a little smaller each year, like the more I grew, the more the trails and trees seemed to shrink. But there was something really comforting about the routine of it all. Setting up camp, helping unload the cooler, gathering kindling. The stuff that used to feel like chores when I was younger turned into something I kind of looked forward to. That particular summer, one of my close friends came with us. We'll call him Nate. He and I had been doing this thing we called the ritual since maybe 2 years earlier. It wasn't really anything serious, just something we did every night after dinner. Once it got properly dark and everyone else had gone quiet, we'd grab flashlights and go for a walk through the woods. No real destination, just walking, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening to the night. The thing was, we rarely used the flashlights. We carried them, yeah, but part of the fun was trying to see how far we could get in the dark without turning them on. Your eyes would adjust after a while, and the moonlight through the trees gave you just enough to make out the path, the bigger rocks and roots. We'd bump into stuff sometimes or trip a little, but we liked that. It felt like exploring, like we were somewhere far away from the campground with all the lanterns and the kids and the noise. This one night, we decided to take the ritual a little further than usual. We figured we knew the woods pretty well by now. We could recognize a lot of the trees, even the spots where the trail dipped or split off. We figured we'd just follow it deeper than we normally went, and then circle back. We didn't tell anyone where we were going. No one ever really asked anyway. They just knew we went for our night walks. We'd usually be back in about an hour. So we headed out, flashlights in hand but turned off, just following the crunch of leaves under our shoes and the occasional glint of moonlight through the branches. It was quiet, not totally silent. You could still hear bugs and a few owls calling out, but the kind of quiet that settles in thick, like sound doesn't travel as far in the dark. We passed the creek maybe 15 minutes in and kept walking. The trail started to narrow a little, and the trees on either side were closer together. We figured we were probably about half a mile or more from our campsite. Farther than we'd gone before, but not by much. We still felt like we knew where we were. It wasn't reckless or anything. We weren't climbing cliffs or trying to get lost. It was just the usual walk, stretched out a bit longer. That's when we heard it. A soft whisper, really faint, just behind us, maybe a few yards back. Not loud enough to make out the words, just the sound of someone's voice. Like they were trying to say something without letting the whole forest hear. We both froze. I remember that really clearly. Our feet just stopped like they had minds of their own. We looked at each other for a second, and then both flipped on our flashlights and spun around. Nothing. Just trees and underbrush and empty trail behind us. The light made everything look flatter and more colorless. Browns and grays and the occasional glint off a rock. We shined the beams in every direction, not moving yet. Just listening. Nothing. No whispering. No footsteps. No sign that anything was off. We figured maybe it was just the wind moving through the branches, or maybe a bug flew near one of our ears, and our brains just filled in the rest. We laughed it off a little, the way you do when you're trying to prove to each other that you're not freaked out. Nate made some joke, something about us being idiots, and we kept walking. But then we heard it again, softer this time, still behind us. Same kind of sound, like someone talking low to themselves or to someone else nearby. Only this time it kept going a little longer, like 2 or 3 seconds before it faded again. We stopped again, flashlights back on, sweeping across the trees. Still nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone. We stayed quiet this time. Just stood there for a minute or two, barely even breathing, trying to pick up anything at all. Eventually, Nate shrugged and said something like we should head back. I agreed. Neither of us said it, but we were both feeling it now. That weird tension in your shoulders when your body's trying to tell you something's not right. So we turned around, back the way we came. The flashlight beams were steady now, pointed low toward the trail, so we didn't trip, but not turned off again. We weren't messing around anymore. We were maybe 5 minutes into the walk back when we both stopped at the same time. Not because of a sound, but because of something we saw. There was someone on the trail ahead of us, on all fours. At first it didn't register. The flashlight beams caught movement, and it looked like an animal crawling across the dirt. But then we saw the shape more clearly, and it was definitely a person. A woman, wearing dark clothes that looked soaked through with dirt. Her hair was a mess, long and tangled. She was crawling, hands and knees on the ground, moving slowly, almost like she didn't know where she was going. And she was whispering to herself. Not even words at first, just sounds. Like she was trying to form them, but they kept slipping out wrong. I don't know how long we just stood there, watching, trying to figure out what we were looking at. It felt like forever, but it was probably 10 seconds, maybe less. Then she looked up and saw us. She froze for a second. Then she stood up fast, not even using her hands. Just pushed herself up in this sudden lurching motion that made both of us jump back a step. She was thin, probably in her 30s, maybe older. It was hard to tell with all the dirt and the bad lighting. She didn't say anything for a few seconds. Just stood there, breathing heavy. Then she said she was trying to find her campsite. That she was lost. We didn't know what to do. Everything about it was off. The crawling, the whispering, the dirt. But she didn't look injured. She wasn't crying or panicked. Just disoriented. Like she didn't fully understand where she was or how she'd gotten there. We asked if she was okay. Actually, we didn't even ask. We kind of gestured and motioned and waited for her to say something else. She just kept saying she needed to get back, needed to find her group. Eventually, we turned around and started walking, and she followed us. We kept our flashlights on the trail. Didn't say much. Just walked. She stayed a few steps behind us the whole time. Every now and then we'd hear her muttering again. Still just bits and pieces of words. Nothing that made sense. One time I heard her say trees and cold in the same sentence, but I couldn't tell if she was talking to us or just herself. When we finally got back near the campsite loop, everything felt more normal again. You could see the glow of campfires and hear voices and laughter. The light from the bathrooms on the hill cut through the dark like a beacon. We brought her toward the center of the loop and started looking around. There were maybe 15 or 20 sites, most of them still awake. We weren't sure where she came from. She didn't recognize anything. Just kept staring at the fire pits and the people like it was all new to her. Eventually, someone noticed us standing there and came over. An older guy, maybe in his 50s, wearing a headlamp and a flannel shirt. We told him what happened, more or less, and pointed to the woman. Turned out she was part of a group staying on the far end of the loop. They'd been drinking most of the night. She got up to use the bathroom and never came back. Her friends thought she went to sleep early. They hadn't even realized she was gone. When they brought her back over to them, there wasn't much reaction. A couple of laughs, one of the guys saying he knew she'd get lost. No one seemed all that worried, just tired and ready to wrap up the night. Nate and I stood there for a while, not really sure how to feel. It was like the tension we'd been carrying for the last 30 minutes suddenly collapsed, but it didn't leave us feeling relieved, just kind of empty. We walked back to our site in silence. No more ritual for that night. Looking back now, I know she was just drunk or high or both. She probably wandered off in the dark, lost her bearings, and panicked. Crawling might have made sense to her in that moment. Whispering, too. I don't know. People act weird when their minds are messed up. But out there, in the woods, half a mile from anyone, in the middle of the dark, it felt like something else. Something out of place. Something we weren't supposed to find. If we hadn't decided to walk that far, I don't know how long she would have been out there. The woods aren't endless, but at night, they might as well be. It's easy to lose the trail. Easy to fall or wander into a ravine or get turned around until you're miles from where you started. She was lucky we found her. I don't think she realized just how lucky. We didn't tell our parents everything. Just said we saw a lady who needed help finding her site. They nodded like it wasn't a big deal. But after that, the ritual changed. We still walk sometimes, but not as far. And we always kept the flashlights on. I still think about that night every once in a while. Not because it was terrifying in the way horror stories usually are, but because of how close it came to being something else. Something worse. And because for a while in those woods, it didn't feel like we were doing the finding. It felt like we were being found. A few years ago, I went for a walk in the woods. It wasn't my usual route, just a small detour from the path I normally took. I like to get lost sometimes, find my way through the underbrush, and really escape the noise of the world. The woods were quiet that day, just the usual sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of something in the leaves. It was one of those peaceful, almost dreamlike days where the trees seemed to have this comforting hush to them. But something was different that day. It wasn't the wind or the usual feel of the air, but something else. As I wandered deeper into the forest, I noticed a smell. At first, it was faint, just a hint of something sweet, something almost pleasant, like a flower blooming somewhere nearby. But the further I walked, the stronger it became. It wasn't like anything I'd ever smelled before. It was overpowering, almost cloying, like honey mixed with rot, sweet but sickly, clinging to the air in a way that made my stomach churn. Curious, I pushed through the undergrowth, brushing aside branches and vines. I didn't know why I didn't turn back. Something about it tugged at me, like I was meant to find out what that smell was. As I pushed deeper, I saw a break in the trees ahead. It wasn't much, just a small clearing, but the smell was coming from there, thick in the air, almost suffocating. I stepped into the clearing, not sure what I was expecting, but not this. Lying there in the center of the small patch of open ground was a man. He was on his back, arms splayed out as though he had fallen there and never moved again. At first, I thought he might just be unconscious, but then I saw it. His skin was discolored, a sickly shade of green and black. The smell was coming from him, I realized. The body had been there for a while. The swelling, the blotched skin, the runny bits of something I didn't want to identify. It was enough to make my stomach lurch. The worst part was his eyes. Even though they were half closed, I could see they were bloodshot and bulging, like something was pushing them from the inside. I stood there frozen for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. My mind couldn't make sense of it. The smell alone was enough to make my head spin. But seeing a body like this, out here in the middle of nowhere, it felt wrong on a level I couldn't explain. Then I did something stupid. I don't know why, but I reached for my phone and dialed the police. Maybe I thought I could help. Maybe I thought they would tell me what to do. When they answered, I told them what I found, and they told me to stay put, that they were sending someone. It didn't take much to figure out that I was in the middle of nowhere. I didn't even know which direction I'd come from, or which way the road was. I was a good distance from any trailhead, surrounded by nothing but trees and the deepening shadows of the late afternoon. The wait felt like hours, though it was probably only about 20 minutes before I heard the sound of sirens off in the distance. They weren't close, not at first, and I couldn't see any sign of them as I sat there, trying to stay calm. The body, though, just lay there, staring up at the sky like it was waiting for something, some kind of answer. The smell kept getting worse, the air thicker with it, and I was forced to breathe through my mouth to avoid gagging. But the worst part, it wasn't even the body itself. It was the quiet, the utter stillness of the woods, the kind of quiet that presses on you like a weight, making you feel like you're not alone, like something is watching, waiting for you to slip up. I kept looking around, but there was nothing. No animals, no movement. Just the hum of distant cars and the occasional breeze pushing through the branches above. It was getting darker now, the light from the fading sun barely filtering through the trees. The shadows were growing longer, stretching across the ground, making everything feel distorted, like it wasn't quite real. My nerves were starting to fray. I kept hearing things, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling was creeping in, making my skin crawl. The forest had never felt so ominous. By the time the police arrived, it was completely dark. I could hear their footsteps before I saw them, the crunch of boots on the dry leaves beneath them. They were cautious when they approached, maybe more so than they should have been. I stayed away from the body as they worked, trying to give them space. One of them asked me how I'd found the body, and I gave them the short version, nothing about the feeling of being watched or the smell that clung to me. The officers didn't say much while they surveyed the scene. They took notes, moved the body with care, trying not to disturb the remains too much. I couldn't stop looking at the body, though, at the way it seemed so out of place in that clearing, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. It wasn't long before they told me what I already suspected. The man had committed suicide. There was a letter tucked into his pocket, and everything about the way his body was positioned suggested he had done it willingly, though the details were too gruesome for me to fully process at the time. He'd been out there for days, maybe longer. The animals had gotten to him, feasting on what they could reach, leaving his body swollen and distorted. The police seemed to know all too well what they were dealing with, and their reactions were businesslike, even as they took pictures and carefully bagged evidence. But it was the waiting that got to me. That, and the feeling that had settled deep in my bones as I sat there, surrounded by the cold dark and the smell of rot. The officers had given me little more than a glance as they left me there, waiting to speak to me again. It was like they didn't want to be near the body, either. And I couldn't blame them. When I finally left, the woods didn't feel the same. I didn't feel safe walking back, as if the trees themselves had turned against me. The whole area felt off, like I had disturbed something that shouldn't have been disturbed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, just out of sight, watching me. That night, I slept fitfully, tossing and turning in my bed, the smell of rot lingering in my nose. But it wasn't just the smell that haunted me. It was the image of his face, twisted and grotesque, staring up at me from that clearing. I dreamt of him, or at least I think I did. In the dreams, he would come closer, his body swollen and covered in dark marks, whispering things I couldn't understand. His presence lingered, heavy in my mind, like a shadow I couldn't escape. The nightmares became a regular thing. At first, I could dismiss them, chalk them up to stress or some strange reaction to what I'd seen, but over time, the dreams changed. They weren't just dreams anymore. They felt real, like he was actually there, speaking to me, telling me how angry he was that I had disturbed his final resting place. The things he said were vile, twisted, urging me to do things that made me shudder. The worst part was how convincing it felt, like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape from. The dreams kept coming. Every night, his twisted face would appear in my sleep, the eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight into mine. He'd be there in the dark, just outside my reach, telling me that I was the one who had disturbed him, that I owed him something for taking him from his resting place. Each time I woke up, drenched in sweat, I felt a little more unsettled, a little more desperate. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just my imagination, but it didn't stop. He kept showing up, night after night, in those same dreams, always angry, always wanting something. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. I started avoiding the woods, even the places I used to go to relax, afraid I might catch a glimpse of something that would trigger another nightmare. But no matter where I went, he was always there in the back of my mind. Months passed, but the dreams didn't stop. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. There were days when I'd be walking down the street, and I'd feel that familiar chill, like he was watching me waiting. And every time, I'd think maybe this time, he'll show up for real. It's been a few years now, and I still think about him. The nightmares come less often, but when they do, they're just as vivid as the first night. He doesn't say much anymore, but I can still feel his anger, like it's hanging in the air, just waiting for me to slip up, to make the wrong move. And tonight, as I sit here writing this, I know he'll be back. I can feel it, like a weight pressing down on me, the same feeling I had that night in the woods. I don't know why he keeps coming, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget the way he looked, the way he made me feel. And I'll never be able to shake the fear that one day, I'll see him again, not in my dreams, but somewhere else. Somewhere I can't run from. I work as a counselor at a summer camp deep in the woods of Southern California, the kind of place where your cell signal disappears the minute you round the last bend of the dirt road leading in. It's quiet out here, quiet in the way that makes your ears ring until the wind rustles the leaves or a bird shouts out from the trees. Camp is surrounded by forest on all sides, nothing but dirt trails and thick pines for miles. At night, it feels like the stars are pressing down on you. No light pollution, no cars, just the buzz of crickets and the occasional rustle of something moving in the dark. We get all kinds of wildlife wandering through. Deer, foxes, rabbits, squirrels. You hear coyotes yipping at night sometimes, usually from far off, and once or twice someone's claimed to spot a mountain lion. There's a weird energy here, too, not in the supernatural sense necessarily, just odd. There are certain places along the trails where it gets colder even when the sun's out, or spots where the air feels heavier. Some of the old staff talk about the land like it's got history buried deep in it. One of the trails has this collapsed stone wall overgrown with ivy that doesn't match any of the terrain, and near the northern edge of camp, there's a big dead oak tree split in half, blackened like it was struck by lightning. Some say it was used as a marker for an old settler route or something, but no one's really sure. Just rumors passed along summer to summer. The ghost stories always come out around the campfires, especially with the younger kids, but we treat them like tradition, stuff to give the place character, not anything to be scared of. On one night late in the summer, the air was unusually still. It had been a hot day, and the woods hadn't cooled off like they normally do once the sun drops. Everything felt kind of heavy. The air was thick and unmoving, and the bugs were louder than usual. After I put my campers to bed, I had a group of younger boys, maybe 9 or 10 years old. I stepped out of the cabin to get a little fresh air. Most nights I'd take a loop around the lower trail or chat with one of the other counselors to unwind a bit. That night, I ended up standing outside our cabin talking to Brian, who was on the team that helped maintain the facilities. We were just standing there near the path talking about nothing in particular when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Sadie came barreling out of the dark from one of the upper trails with her entire cabin behind her. 12 teenage girls, all dressed in black, looking wide-eyed and shaken. Sadie herself wasn't yelling or anything, but she looked freaked out in a way I hadn't seen before. Normally, she was the cool-headed one, always calm under pressure, the one who handled the scary stories and homesick kids without blinking. But right then, she looked like she'd sprinted a mile and hadn't stopped running mentally. As she passed us, she looked straight at me and shouted that she thought they'd heard a ghost, and that once her campers were down, she'd come back to meet me to explain. Then they were gone, all of them hurrying toward the row of girls' cabins by the main mess hall. Brian and I looked at each other, confused. We didn't say much, just sort of shrugged and went back to our own routines. But it stuck with me. Sadie didn't rattle easily. She came back about a half hour later, just as I was finishing sweeping off the front step of our cabin. She was still wearing all black, her face a little pale under the porch light. She stood in front of me for a second, like she was trying to figure out how to explain it all, and then she just let it spill out. They'd taken the girls on a night hike. It was a fun activity we did sometimes, part of the Ninja Trail, thing that some cabins organized to make the night hikes exciting. They dressed all in black, hiked up the ridge, moved as quietly as possible. It was supposed to be about stealth and teamwork and trust. According to Sadie, everything was fine until they were on their way back, just past a fork in the trail where the trees grow thick and the light doesn't reach even during the day. That's when they heard it, a faint voice, just off the trail, somewhere behind the first row of trees. A child's voice calling help. Not loud, soft, distant, but definitely a voice. She said it was so faint at first she thought it was her imagination. But then it called again. Help. A little louder. One of her campers heard it too, then another. They all stopped in their tracks, listening. Then it came again, only this time it was wrong. Warped. The tone was weird. The pitch didn't change like it should with a human voice. She said it was like someone playing a recording and slowly twisting the knob until it didn't sound human anymore. But it still used the same word. Help. Sadie said the third time it sounded less like a child and more like something trying to sound like a child. That's when they ran. She didn't try to rationalize it. She said the moment she heard that last help, her instincts screamed at her to get the girls out. She didn't wait to process it. She just booked it down the trail and didn't stop running until they were back near the mess hall. When she told me all of that, I didn't know what to think. But I know Sadie. She wouldn't freak out unless it was real enough anyway, to scare her into leaving a trail mid-hike with a dozen campers in the dark. So we decided to go check it out. Just the two of us. Not because we thought we'd find anything, but because we didn't want that lingering in the air. It was one thing for her to be scared, but she didn't want it spreading to the other kids. We figured if we could go out there and hear nothing, see nothing, it would be easier to chalk it up to some weird sound carrying through the hills or some kid pulling a prank. It was probably an animal. We told ourselves that. We left about 10 minutes later with our headlamps on low and flashlights tucked in our pockets. The woods were dead quiet when we started walking up the trail. No crickets, no wind, just the crunch of gravel under our shoes and the occasional branch cracking in the trees somewhere above. Every shadow looked a little too deep. Every stump or log seemed like something crouching until we got close enough to see it clearly. The air felt dense again, like walking through something thick and invisible. The stretch of trail where they'd heard the voice wasn't far, maybe a 5-minute walk. As we got closer, I could feel my stomach tightening, my breath shortening a little without me realizing it. I wasn't scared exactly, not yet, just tense in the way your body gets when it knows it's somewhere it doesn't belong. We rounded the corner to the fork in the trail, and that's when we heard it. It didn't sound like a kid anymore. It was loud, louder than Sadie had described, and it wasn't coming from any one place. It was coming from everywhere. The hills, the trees, the ground. It was high-pitched and twisted, like a scream run through a broken speaker, sharp enough to make your teeth hurt. The word was still help, but it wasn't said like a request anymore. It was a screech, a distorted, stretched-out mockery of the word, like something pretending to be a kid, but not doing a good job anymore. It echoed through the trees without ever bouncing off anything. Just this continuous, distant yet close wail that made my knees feel like they were full of water. We froze, both of us, just stood there in the middle of the trail like statues while that thing kept screaming. It didn't come closer. It didn't change. It just went on in that same unnatural tone. I turned to Sadie. She looked how I felt, frozen, unsure if we should move or not. Then, without a word, we both turned and started walking back. Not running, not yet. Just walking, fast and stiff, like we didn't want to attract attention. But that sound followed us. It didn't grow fainter as we walked away. If anything, it sounded like it stayed the same, like we weren't leaving it behind. We didn't start running until we were almost back at camp. When the mess hall lights came into view, we broke into a jog without even deciding to, and we didn't stop until we were on the front steps. That was the first time either of us spoke since it started. We didn't even try to make sense of it. We just stood there, sweating and panting, our hands shaking. The next morning, we told the story to anyone who'd listen. Some believed us, others just laughed. We were counselors, not kids, so we weren't going to get in trouble, but the story spread fast. Most people figured we'd heard a bobcat or some kind of bird, and our minds played tricks on us. Sadie didn't argue, but I could tell she didn't believe that. Neither did I. That afternoon, the camp director called a meeting for all the staff. He didn't mention the story directly, but he told us to make sure we explained to our campers that bobcats lived in the forest and made high-pitched yelping noises at night. He said they were harmless, and that sometimes their calls could sound like a child crying. He said we should remind the campers not to be scared if they heard anything strange at night, that it was all part of living in the woods. Everyone had a good laugh at our expense. The ghost of the Ridge Trail became a running joke for the rest of the summer. People would randomly whisper, help behind us during meal times, or leave weird notes on our bunks. It was funny after a while, I guess. We let them tease us. But Sadie and I never went back to that stretch of trail after dark again. Not once. I don't know what we heard that night. Maybe it was a bobcat. Maybe it was a bird or the wind or some kind of animal I've never heard before. But I know what it felt like. It didn't feel like something natural. It felt wrong. It felt like something that wasn't supposed to be out there. Something that knew we were listening. And even now, years later, when I think back on it, I can still hear that sound echoing from the hills. That awful voice, almost human, calling for help in a way that made you want to run, not save it. We never got an answer, and maybe that's for the best. Some things out there, in the deep parts of the woods, just don't need explanations. They just need distance. My uncle's place isn't the kind of spot you just stumble across. You don't pass by it on the way to somewhere else, or see it from the highway and decide to pull over for a visit. You have to mean to get there. It's tucked out in the middle of nowhere, way past the paved roads, beyond where GPS starts second-guessing itself. 2 miles at least from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by a sprawl of woods and pastures. The kind of quiet you don't notice until you realize how heavy the silence sits out there, only broken by the wind in the trees or the distant moo of cattle. No traffic, no sirens, no humming streetlights. But it's beautiful. My uncle built his house from the ground up, all by hand. Cut the lumber, poured the concrete, laid the shingles, the whole thing. He's the type who knows how to do anything with just his hands and time. The house has a broad, wraparound deck that catches the breeze just right. On summer afternoons, it feels like the whole place floats on that deck. It's where everyone gathers, family, friends, neighbors from miles off when they do make it over. We host cookouts there sometimes, or just sit and talk for hours. You can see the sun go down over the hills without anything in the way. It was one of those full-day family get-togethers that brought me out there. Probably 20 adults scattered around, 6 or 7 kids darting through legs and running in circles, chasing each other across the big mowed field that stretches out from the front of the house. It had been hot all day. That kind of dry, sun-bleached heat where the ground starts to crack and the air hums with insects. But there was a breeze that kept it just shy of unbearable. You could feel it curling off the trees now and then, cooling your neck just enough that you didn't really notice how much the sun had worn you down until the shadows started to stretch. I'd been there since before noon, helping get things set up, moving coolers, bringing chairs out, dodging kids with dripping popsicles. As the sun started tipping lower, someone realized we were running short on a few things. Burger buns, ice, a few extra drinks. The usual. I don't remember who asked me to go, but I volunteered. The drive wasn't too far, about 30 minutes into the closest town, but when you're the one driving it, it feels longer. The roads twist through the trees, then open wide into rolling fields, then narrow again through patches of woods where the tree limbs hang over the top like they're trying to knit themselves shut. I left just before 6, I think. The sun was still up, but it was slipping quick. I remember because the sky had that orange tint in the rearview mirror that only lasts a few minutes, where everything looks like it's been dipped in honey. I wasn't gone long, just the usual run. Pulled into the store, grabbed a cart, picked up what I needed, loaded up. Maybe 45 minutes, an hour round trip. But that time of year, once the sun hits the horizon, darkness moves fast. There's not much in the way of light pollution out there, and the trees soak up whatever's left. You don't ease into night. It just drops like a curtain. By the time I turned off the highway and onto the gravel road that leads to my uncle's house, it was already dark. My headlights picked up dust in the air, thick from the dry road, hanging in little clouds as I crept forward. The edges of the woods pressed in from both sides. You can tell when you're getting close because the trees break into pasture again, and you pass the rusted-out gate where the cattle used to wander back and forth. I remember the dust rattling against the wheel wells, the way the tires crunched on the rock, how the bugs would flick across the windshield like sparks. And then, I was pulling up to the house. The lights from the deck were glowing warm and soft, spilling out into the dark like a small island. I could hear music, laughter, the distant echo of kids yelling something over each other. The field in front of the house had a few folding tables set up, people standing around with drinks, someone tending the grill. Everything looked normal, like nothing had changed in the short time I'd been gone. And then my headlights lit something up. It was sitting near the edge of the open field, right at the boundary where the mowed grass turned back into woods. At first, I couldn't tell what I was looking at. Just a shape. Black, low to the ground, still. My headlights hit it straight on, but it didn't flinch, didn't move. It looked like a shadow that had grown too thick, too solid. Then it turned its head slightly, and I saw the eyes catch the light. Not in that sharp, glowing way deer do, or the scattered flash of a raccoon. Just a faint reflection, like the dull shine of dark glass. It was a panther. It sounds impossible, I know. Most people don't believe they exist out here anymore. Technically, they're not supposed to be around. But there it was, big as anything, long tail curling behind it, shoulders low, ears pointed. The body was sleek and heavy-looking, built like it was carved out of shadow. Its fur didn't shine under the headlights the way a dog's would. It just absorbed the light, like it wasn't there and was there at the same time. It wasn't moving, just sitting calm, still, staring out toward the deck, toward the people, toward the kids. It was close enough that I could see the way its ribs moved when it breathed. Slow, measured. It looked relaxed, like it had settled in and had been sitting there for a while watching, like it wasn't in any hurry. And even though the party was going on just yards away, no one had noticed it. The music kept playing. The laughter kept going. Kids kept running around the field. But that panther wasn't watching all of them. Its head was angled toward one specific part of the deck, where the kids had been playing a game earlier, running back and forth in the grass. It wasn't lunging or stalking, but it was paying attention, focused. It hadn't looked at me yet. I stayed in the car. My engine was still running, headlights fixed on it. The groceries were sweating in the back seat, but I wasn't thinking about those. I wasn't thinking about anything except how quiet it was inside the car compared to the noise outside. How surreal it felt. I blinked a few times, like maybe I was just seeing things, maybe a trick of the light, maybe my eyes were tired. But it didn't change. It was real. Then, slowly, it turned its head and looked right at me. Not startled, not afraid, just a slow glance, casual, like it had known I was there all along, and finally decided to acknowledge me. Our eyes met for a second, maybe two, and in that moment, something passed between us that I can't explain. Not communication, not emotion, just a kind of awareness. It saw me, and I saw it. No glass, no metal, no lights or fences in between could make that moment feel less raw. And then, the strangest part, it looked away, not in fear or panic, but with the air of someone who'd been caught doing something they weren't supposed to be doing, but didn't care. It gave this sigh. I don't even know how to explain it properly. It wasn't a growl or a huff or a snort. It was a sigh, like the sound a person makes when they realize they've stayed too long at a party they weren't invited to. It was so deeply human, it chilled me more than anything else. Like it had made a decision. Then it stood up, turned slowly, and walked off into the woods. No rush, no fear. Just disappeared between the trees like it had melted back into the dark. The bushes swayed slightly, and then even that stopped. Silence again. I sat there in the driver's seat for a long time. Long enough that the condensation from the grocery bags had started to fog the windows. I was gripping the steering, like I was still driving. My heart wasn't pounding like you'd expect. It was more like it had stopped altogether for a minute and was just starting to pick back up. I didn't move. I don't think I breathed much. I just sat, eyes fixed on the spot where it had been, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Eventually, I turned off the car, grabbed the groceries, and forced myself to walk up to the deck. My legs felt stiff, like they didn't want to carry me. Every crunch of gravel under my feet sounded too loud. I kept glancing to the side, toward the edge of the woods, expecting to see those eyes again. But nothing moved. The party went on like nothing had happened. I stepped into the light of the porch. People smiled. Someone took the bags out of my hands. Someone else handed me a drink. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, watching the tree line. Eventually, I told a few people. Quietly, carefully. Most brushed it off. Said it was probably a big dog or a bobcat, maybe a trick of the light. But a few looked at me and didn't laugh. They knew how the woods can hold things we pretend aren't there anymore. The rest of the evening went on, but I kept watching the edge of the field. I noticed the kids didn't stray as far after that. I don't think they knew why, but they stayed closer to the adults. I stayed late, helped clean up, and drove home down that same gravel road, checking every shadow twice. I never saw it again, but I'll never forget the way it looked back at me. Not angry, not scared, just aware. Like it had been watching us long before I'd arrived. Like it had done this before. And the way it walked off calm, unbothered, made it feel like it could be out there still, watching again sometime. Not because it needed to, just because it could. That's what stuck with me the most. The panther wasn't lost. It wasn't cornered or confused. It wasn't even hunting, not exactly. It was visiting, and it knew the way home. I had been looking forward to this backpacking trip for months. A few of us had decided to head into the Sawtooths, a rugged range of mountains in Idaho, known for their jagged peaks and steep, rocky terrain. We had chosen a spot deep in the bottom of a narrow valley, tucked between towering rock walls on either side. The plan was to camp there for a few nights, hoping to get away from the noise of the world and enjoy some solitude in nature. We'd spent the day hiking up, the sun casting long shadows over the craggy cliffs as we made our way through the dense forest. The valley we'd chosen was beautiful, and at first, it felt like a perfect place to settle in for the night. We set up our tents in a small clearing, with the tall granite walls looming overhead, their sheer faces almost seeming to touch the sky. The air was cool, with a fresh breeze that carried the earthy scent of pine and moss. We gathered some firewood, made dinner, and settled around the campfire, telling stories and enjoying the peace that comes with being so far from civilization. By the time we crawled into our tents, the sky had darkened, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees and the soft crackling of the fire dying down. I laid there in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, trying to relax. The feeling of being so small in such a vast, wild place was both exhilarating and a little unsettling, but I was too tired to be bothered by it. My eyes closed, and I drifted into a deep sleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep when it happened. The sound came first, like a distant thunderclap, low and rumbling, followed by a sharp crack that jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, maybe a tree branch snapping, but then I heard it again, louder this time and closer. The sound of rocks tumbling down the side of the valley. I sat up in my tent, heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear. The rumbling grew louder, followed by a crashing noise that made the ground beneath me tremble. The rocks were coming down. I could hear them smashing into trees, splintering wood, the thunderous sound of massive boulders rolling and tumbling. It sounded like an avalanche, but it wasn't snow, it was rock, and it was coming straight for us. I froze, my mind racing. The noise continued, growing ever closer. For a moment, I considered bolting out of my tent, but I quickly dismissed the idea. It was pitch black outside. There was no way I could see anything, let alone make a run for it. Even if I could see the rocks coming, I wouldn't know where they were going or how to avoid them. I was trapped in this small, fragile tent, stuck in the middle of a valley with no escape. My breathing quickened as I tried to process what was happening. The rocks continued their descent, crashing and smashing, getting closer and closer with every passing second. I couldn't help but picture them tumbling down the rock walls, one after another, their weight and force unstoppable. It was hard to believe something so huge and powerful could be so close, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I pressed my palms against the ground, feeling the vibrations from the rocks as they rumbled down the hillside. The sound was deafening now, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. For what felt like an eternity, the noise raged on, like the world was coming to an end. I kept my body as still as possible, listening for any sign that the rocks were near, hoping they wouldn't strike our camp. The thought of one of those boulders smashing into my tent, crushing everything in its path, was almost too much to bear. But what could I do? There was no way to escape. My best option was to stay hidden, to hope that I had set my tent in a spot that would be safe from the falling rocks. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare even breathe too loudly. It felt like the world had gone silent around me, as if everything had stopped, holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen. The only sound I could hear was the deafening crash of rock against tree, the echoes of destruction reverberating off the stone walls of the valley. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, I didn't know if I could even trust my own senses. My heart was still racing, but I couldn't hear the rocks anymore. It was as if the valley had swallowed them whole. I lay there in the dark, my body tense, listening for any sign that it was over, that the danger had passed. It felt like hours before I heard anything again. The first sound was a distant crack, like the breaking of a twig, then another and another. It was impossible to tell how far away they were, but they were softer now, less intense. I slowly let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The rock slide had stopped, but the fear didn't leave me. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, too shaken to fall back asleep. The valley felt more alive now, more dangerous. The silence seemed too loud, too heavy. I could still feel the rumble of the rocks in my bones, the fear that something could happen at any moment. Morning came slowly, the first light creeping over the valley floor and bathing everything in pale, cold light. We all emerged from our tents, still groggy and shaken from the night's events. There was an eerie quiet in the air, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. We didn't talk about the rock slide at first, but we all knew what had happened. We'd all heard it, the terrifying sound of rocks tumbling down the hillside, getting closer and closer with every second. We ventured out of camp cautiously, to see if we could find any signs of where the rocks had come from. There were no boulders in our immediate vicinity, but the forest was littered with the debris of smaller rocks and broken branches. The ground was pocked with deep impressions where the rocks had crashed down. We couldn't tell for sure how close the rocks had come to our camp, but we knew they had been close enough to feel the ground shake beneath us. We spent the rest of the day packing up our gear, the tension still hanging in the air. Everyone was on edge, trying to shake off the feeling of helplessness that had come with the night's events. But it was hard to forget that feeling of being completely at the mercy of the mountains. We were so small, so fragile, surrounded by forces beyond our control. There was no way to predict when or where the next rock slide might come, no way to prepare for it. We had been lucky this time, but we all knew that luck wouldn't last forever. As we packed up our camp and made our way out of the valley, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been mere specks in the grand scheme of things. The valley, the mountains, the rocks, it all seemed so ancient, so permanent. And we were just visitors passing through, hoping to survive and leave without incident. But the mountains didn't care about us. The rocks didn't care about us. They were just doing what they had always done, moving and shifting with the forces of nature, indifferent to the people who happened to be in their path. When we finally left the valley, I looked back one last time, the sight of the rocky walls looming high above, still and silent. The danger had passed, but the memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder of just how small and fragile we are in the face of nature's power. I didn't know if I would ever return to the Sawtooths, but one thing was certain. I would never forget that feeling of helplessness, of being at the mercy of a world so much bigger than myself. I was 15 the night it happened. It was in the middle of summer, sometime in July. School was out, but I hadn't made many plans for the break yet. Most of my friends were off doing their own thing, some traveling, others at camp, and a few just wrapped up in their own lives. I'd been asked to babysit my nephews for the night, which wasn't anything new. I'd done it before plenty of times. It was a way to help out my brother and his wife, and make a bit of extra money too. They had 4 boys total, but only 2 of them were my brother's biological kids. The youngest 2, 18 months and 4 years old, were the ones I spent most of my time with that night. My brother and his wife were going to a family dinner across town. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just dinner with her side of the family. They weren't planning on staying late, maybe until midnight, but as always, they said if the kids were good and I didn't mind staying longer, I could crash on the couch until morning. It was easier than waking them up and driving home anyway. Their house was quiet once the boys were down. The baby slept in a small room right off the living room downstairs, close to the kitchen. His crib was pushed into the far corner, and a little sound machine hummed softly beside it. The 4-year-old, along with the 2 older boys, who were technically their cousins but raised like brothers, slept in a shared bedroom upstairs. The older 2 were nearly teens themselves, so I didn't keep much of an eye on them. They had their own routines and pretty much kept to themselves unless something went wrong. That night, they'd all gone to bed around 9:30, without much fuss. I'd made myself comfortable on the living room couch, under a blanket with one of my favorite books in hand. I remember the air conditioner kicking on every now and then, making that low hum that fills the space between your thoughts. The lights were dimmed, just the one on the side table by the couch still on. I had a glass of water beside me, and my phone face down on the armrest. It was just me, the soft rustle of paper, and the occasional sleepy noises from the baby monitor sitting on the coffee table. Time passed slowly. I remember glancing at the clock above the TV now and then, watching the red digital numbers shift from 10:43 to 11:58, and eventually over into the next day. I wasn't really tired, but I was relaxed, half lost in the story I was reading. The house felt safe, familiar. I knew it well. I'd spent weekends here, helped my brother mow the lawn, baked cookies in that kitchen. There was nothing eerie about it, nothing to make you feel uneasy. It must have been just after 1 a.m. when I heard the noise. It wasn't loud or sudden, just a soft thump, and then something like footsteps. It wasn't heavy, more like the padding of little feet. I paused, holding my breath for a second to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The monitor hadn't picked up any cries or fussing, but I knew that noise came from upstairs. I set the book down, got up, and made my way quietly across the living room. I passed the baby's room as I headed for the stairs, glancing in just to be sure. He was asleep, curled on his side with one hand near his face. The white noise machine buzzed steadily. The staircase creaked like it always did, especially on the 3rd step from the bottom. I stepped over it out of habit and continued up. The hallway upstairs was dark, but a small nightlight plugged into the wall gave off a faint orange glow. It wasn't much, but enough to make out shapes. The boy's bedroom door was half open. I pushed it gently and stepped in. The 4-year-old was out of bed. He stood near the window, his little pajama shirt bunched at the side like he'd twisted it in his hands. He was crying, but not loudly. Just small whimpers, soft enough that I knew the others hadn't woken up. He looked out of it, like he wasn't fully awake. I'd seen that look before, kind of dazed, eyes half-lidded, mouth slack like he didn't know where he was. I crouched down and reached for him, but he didn't back away. He just stood there, breathing unevenly. I didn't know what to make of it at first. He wasn't the kind of kid to sleepwalk, and he'd never really woken up in the middle of the night before. I guided him gently back toward his bed, pulling the covers up around him. His eyes were open, but I could tell he wasn't all the way there. He didn't resist, didn't speak much, just a whisper of "I don't know" when I asked what was wrong. His brothers didn't stir, still bundled up in their own beds. I waited a few minutes, standing there quietly to make sure he settled. Then I heard the baby cry. It started out quiet, like a single startled wail, then quickly turned into a full cry. I hurried downstairs, more concerned than I expected to be. He wasn't usually one to wake up unless he was sick or hungry, and he'd eaten well before bed. When I opened the nursery door, I saw him standing in his crib, tiny hands clutching the wooden rail, his cheeks damp. His cry was urgent, loud in that small space. I picked him up, rocked him gently, whispering softly, trying to soothe him. It didn't take long, maybe 2 or 3 minutes before he calmed down. I sat down in the rocking chair with him, his body pressed against mine, head nestled under my chin. I remember the smell of the baby lotion his mom used. It was something floral and light. The hum of the sound machine had faded under his cries, but now filled the quiet again. His breathing evened out, slow and soft against my neck. I held him a little longer, just in case, then laid him gently back down in his crib. He stayed asleep. I stayed by the crib for a minute longer than I needed to. I didn't feel scared, not exactly, but something felt off. Like the house had shifted in tone ever so slightly. Not in a big way, just enough to make me listen harder to the silence. When I stepped back into the living room, my phone lit up on the couch. The screen glowed with a call from my mom. I wasn't expecting to hear from her at that hour. I picked up quickly, more confused than anything. She didn't waste time. She sounded tired and serious, her voice lower than usual. She told me my grandmother had just passed away. I didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. She didn't give many details, just that it had happened about 10 minutes ago. Peacefully, in her sleep, at the care home she'd been in for the past few months. My parents were going to go over there in the morning. I said okay, that I was fine, that the boys were asleep, and everything was okay. After we hung up, I stood in the middle of the room for a while, still holding the phone in my hand. The lamp was still on, casting its dull yellow light across the carpet. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears. I sat down slowly and stared at the ceiling for a long time. I thought about the timing, how both of the youngest kids had woken up around the same moment, for no reason I could see. How the 4-year-old had been crying, completely out of sorts, and how the baby had cried too, louder and more desperate than usual. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the 4-year-old had a bad dream. Maybe the baby heard something. Maybe the air conditioning kicked in with a loud rattle, or a car drove by. It wasn't impossible. Still, something about it all clung to me for the rest of the night. The timing, the way they reacted, as if something in the house had shifted before anyone even knew the news. I didn't go back to my book. I sat on the couch, blanket pulled up to my shoulders, watching the shadows shift as the lamp flickered slightly now and then. I stayed that way until nearly 3 a.m. when I finally dozed off. The next morning, when my brother and his wife came home, I didn't say much about it. I told them the boys had been good, just a little restless around 1 a.m., but they'd gone back to sleep quickly. My brother mentioned getting a text from my mom and nodded quietly when I brought up our grandmother. He looked tired too. None of us said much after that. In the days that followed, I thought more about that night than I expected to. Not in a spooky way. I didn't believe in anything magical. But I thought about how kids pick up on things adults don't always notice. Maybe it wasn't anything. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe they felt something, an absence, a change in the air, something shifting in their world that they couldn't explain. Kids don't need explanations. They just react. I didn't bring it up to anyone else. I didn't want to make it sound like more than it was. But I remembered it, every part. The sound of the steps upstairs. The way the 4-year-old looked out of place in his own room. The way the baby cried like he'd been dropped into cold water. The call from my mom. The quiet afterward. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I still think about that moment between when I tucked the boys back in and when the phone rang. That small sliver of time when the house was calm again, but I hadn't yet known what had happened. It wasn't scary, not really. Just heavy. Like something passed through the house, unnoticed but not unfelt. I never forgot it, and I don't think I ever will. My house sits farther back in the lot than most other houses on the street, making it feel isolated, and it's not laid out like the typical homes around here. The sidewalk runs the full length of the living room, ending at the front porch, which opens directly into the living room. This makes the whole front of the house feel exposed. The windows, large and unmovable, allow a lot of light to pour into the room, but they also strip me of any sense of privacy. Anyone walking by can clearly see inside. It's both beautiful and a little unnerving at times. It was one of those rare occasions when my family had gone on vacation, leaving me with the house all to myself. I was looking forward to having some time to relax, but I also had the chance to indulge in something I didn't normally get to do. Drink without anyone telling me to slow down. So, after a few beers, I poured myself a glass of whiskey, slumped into the couch, and let the alcohol work its magic. I wasn't planning on getting too drunk, but it wasn't long before I passed out, the buzz overwhelming my body. I woke up in the dim light of the living room, disoriented. For a moment, I couldn't even remember where I was. The chill in the room was palpable, and for some strange reason, it made me uncomfortable. It wasn't just the cold that set me on edge, though. Something felt wrong. I turned my head slowly, trying to shake off the sleep, but the unease lingered. My heart rate began to pick up as my mind tried to piece together why I felt so unsettled. Then I heard it, a banging noise, sharp and urgent, coming from above me. It sounded like something, or someone, was pounding on the glass. At first, I froze, trying to process what was happening. Was it a branch in the wind, or was someone really outside? I didn't dare move, but my eyes instinctively drifted toward the window above the couch. I tried to make sense of the darkness outside, but all I could see were vague shadows. The banging continued relentlessly, each thud a heavy reminder that I wasn't alone. It was coming from the window directly above me. I glanced at the cable box on the table next to me. The time read 3:05 a.m. I knew no one would be out there at this hour. My parents and siblings were miles away, and the thought of anyone else being around didn't make sense. But still, the noise kept coming, louder now, almost as if it were deliberately trying to draw attention. I kept my body as still as possible, trying to stay out of view, and tried to make sense of what was going on. The pounding grew even more insistent, and just when I thought I could take no more, it stopped. For a brief moment, I felt the slightest sense of relief, but that relief didn't last. The silence felt suffocating. Before I could even process it, I heard another noise, this time from the front door. Someone was now banging on the door, just as forcefully as the sound from the window above me. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to move. Whoever was out there wasn't just making noise. They were demanding something, trying to get my attention. I didn't dare go to the door, but I felt the pull to do something, anything. It was like a magnetic force, urging me to act, but my instincts told me to stay put. My heart thudded heavily in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. The knocking at the door continued, relentless and unyielding. It felt like it was never going to stop. It went on for what felt like forever, maybe 40 minutes, with no signs of stopping. The banging was deafening, reverberating through the walls of the house. I tried to tell myself it was just someone playing a prank, or maybe someone in trouble, but something in my gut told me this wasn't a coincidence. Something wasn't right. Finally, the noise stopped. There was a brief moment of silence, and I strained to listen for any movement outside. I dared not look out the window, but I was too scared to move. I just lay there, trying to keep as still as possible, waiting for whatever would come next. After what seemed like an eternity, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away from the door. The air felt thick with tension, and I was terrified to leave my spot on the couch. I stayed there for what felt like hours, not daring to move. My body was shaking, the adrenaline still pumping through me. I couldn't bring myself to sleep again, so I stayed awake, the fear creeping in again every time I thought I heard something. The minutes ticked by slowly, but eventually, the early morning light began to filter through the windows, casting long shadows in the room. It wasn't until then that I gathered the courage to check the house. I tiptoed to the door, pressing my ear against the wood to see if anyone was still outside. I could hear nothing but the quiet of the morning. Tentatively, I opened the door just a crack and looked outside. The yard was empty. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the dew, no sign that anyone had even been there. It was as if the whole thing had been a figment of my imagination. I slammed the door shut and locked it, still unsure of what had happened. The knocking was gone, but the terror lingered in my mind. I thought about calling the police, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I say? That someone had banged on my windows and doors for 40 minutes in the middle of the night? Who would believe me? The next day, I called my friend to see if he would come over and stay with me for the rest of the week. I needed someone around, anyone to help me feel safe. But when I told him what had happened, he laughed it off. "What the fuck for? So that we can both be murdered in our sleep," he said. His response made my stomach churn, but I knew he was trying to make light of the situation. I was desperate, but there was no comfort to be found in his words. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't. For the next few days, I avoided the living room. I couldn't stand the idea of being near those windows again, of being vulnerable and exposed like that. The house felt wrong, like it was taunting me. I stayed in my room most of the time, trying to forget what had happened, but the memory wouldn't leave me. It was like a shadow that followed me around, always lurking just behind me. Weeks passed, and nothing else unusual happened. The house returned to normal, but my nerves were still shot. I couldn't explain it, but I felt different, jumpy on edge. I couldn't look out those big windows without imagining someone standing just beyond the glass, watching me. I never did find out who or what had been outside that night, and I still wonder if it was someone who meant me harm, or if it was just an elaborate prank. I don't think I'll ever know the truth, but that night left a mark on me that hasn't faded. The terror I felt that night, the uncertainty of what was happening just beyond my windows, it's something I'll never forget. To this day, I'm extra cautious at night, and I don't take the peace and quiet of my house for granted. When my family came home from their vacation, I couldn't bring myself to tell them everything that had happened. But I've made sure to lock all the windows and doors every night, just in case. And every once in a while, when I'm alone at night, I can still hear the faint echo of the banging. Though now, I'm not sure if it's just my mind playing tricks on me. It was the middle of nowhere in Arizona, a vast stretch of barren land surrounded by nothing but dry desert, cacti, and the occasional low brush. Our group of friends, about 6 of us in total, had decided to go camping for the weekend. We were all young, stupid, and thought we were invincible, but that weekend would soon show us how wrong we were. The sun had set hours ago, casting a thick blanket of darkness across the desert. We were camping in an area near Tucson, miles away from civilization. No other campsites were nearby, just the occasional distant headlights of travelers on the highway. It felt isolated and peaceful, a perfect spot for a getaway. We set up our tents in a loose circle, gathered around a campfire, and cracked open some beers. We had a pretty standard camping setup. I was sharing a 2-person tent with my best friend, Jason. The others had their own tents scattered around the site, each one just far enough away that we couldn't hear them clearly if we weren't paying attention. The fire flickered, its warm glow casting shadows on the surrounding desert, the only light for miles. It felt like we were the only ones left on Earth. As the night wore on, the desert air grew chilly, and we settled into our tents. I remember lying on my back, listening to the soft rustle of the wind against the canvas. It was that perfect kind of silence, still but not oppressive. It felt safe, or at least it did, until everything changed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise, a soft, wet sniffing sound. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as the seconds passed, it became undeniable. Someone was outside our tent. I tensed up, trying to control my breathing. The sniffing was slow, deliberate, like whatever it was taking its time, moving along the edge of our tent. I could hear it shift from side to side, getting closer to the opening. My immediate thought was, it's got to be a bear. The idea of it being a wild animal wasn't too far-fetched, given that we were in the middle of the desert with no food properly secured. We'd been dumb enough to leave some food out by the fire earlier, and I had a sick feeling that my careless friends hadn't tied up the garbage bags properly. My heart started pounding as I listened. I could hear it now, sniffing the air outside, its nose scraping along the fabric of the tent. The low, wet exhale sent a shiver through me. I waited in silence for a few seconds, but then I heard it, movement. The sniffing stopped, and I could hear it moving away, heading toward the next tent. My body went rigid. I wasn't the only one awake. I could feel Jason's breath quicken beside me, and his hand brushed mine. Without saying a word, we both just knew. Our other friends had heard it too. The sniffing had stopped at the other tent, and now it was quiet again. Then, all hell broke loose. Without any warning, we heard a loud voice, one of our friends, Ryan, shouting, "Hey, get the hell away from here." I nearly jumped out of my skin. Then, the unmistakable sound of something heavy stumbling across the ground, like it was scrambling to get away. Another voice. What the hell is going on? Ryan's gunshot followed immediately, a sharp, cracking pop that sent the desert into a momentary panic. We were all frozen in place, unsure of what was happening. The sound of heavy footsteps faded away quickly, but the tension remained. Was it a bear? No, it was something else. Someone else. My mind raced, but my body didn't want to move. I wasn't sure if it was fear or confusion holding me in place, but when Jason finally grabbed my arm, I understood. We needed to get out of there. Ryan came running back to our tent, still holding his gun. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "It's a guy," he said in a breathless whisper. "Some crazy person has been sniffing our tents and went through our food." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. We hadn't been dealing with a wild animal at all. We'd been watched. Ryan quickly gathered the others, and we all started packing up our stuff in a hurry. No one said much. There was nothing to say. We didn't know if the guy was still out there or if he'd come back. We just packed everything as fast as we could. The sounds of rustling tents and gear in the dark echoed in the quiet desert night. By the time we were packed and ready to leave, we'd all agreed. We weren't staying another minute. We piled into our vehicles, our trucks, SUVs, whatever we could find, and drove off. We didn't even know if the guy was still lurking around, but we didn't care. We had no intention of sticking around to find out. Whatever happened that night, it wasn't worth the risk. The next day, we were all back at our homes, and the haunting feeling of being watched never left. We'd convinced ourselves it was just a one-time thing, a fluke. But deep down, we all knew something wasn't right out there in the desert. And for a while, we all tried to ignore the nagging thought in the back of our minds. What kind of person goes around sniffing people's tents in the middle of the night? A year later, we made the same mistake. We went back to the same area near Tucson, convinced that what had happened the year before was just a one-off event. We decided to camp differently this time, thinking we'd outsmart any creepers. Instead of sleeping in tents, we slept in the beds of our trucks and SUVs. We thought it was genius. No wild animal could sniff around a Toyota Tacoma, right? This time, the night was even quieter than before. The air was still, and the stars hung low in the sky. Everyone was asleep by around midnight, and I was already passed out in the back of my SUV, my girlfriend next to me. I had fallen into a deep sleep, the kind that wraps around you, and everything seemed peaceful. But then I felt something. It wasn't a noise or a smell. It was a presence. A light, bright enough to filter through the windows of my SUV and cast a shadow over my face, waking me instantly. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a prank, maybe messing with their flashlights. But something didn't feel right. The light didn't flicker like it should have if it were from a flashlight. It stayed steady, unmoving. I kept my eyes closed, hoping that whoever it was would think I was still asleep. I didn't move a muscle. It could have been anyone. It could have been one of my friends, maybe just checking to see if we were okay. But as I lay there, I realized something. No one was making noise. No one had shifted in their trucks. No one had moved. I listened carefully, trying to hear anything unusual. Nothing but the faint sound of snoring from the other side of the camp. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone's footsteps crunching on the dirt. They were walking around the camp, the sound getting closer and closer to my truck. The light moved, and I could hear the person stop right next to my SUV. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. I dared not breathe, my heart hammering in my chest. Whoever this was, they were standing right outside, just inches from me. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their presence. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the light moved again. I peeked through the crack in the window, just enough to see the outline of the person. It was an older man. His face was illuminated in the light, and I could see his eyes, wide and unblinking, staring at me through the window. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see the movement of my eyes, but I couldn't help it. His gaze seemed to pierce right through the darkness. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the truck, watching. I didn't know if he was looking at me or the others, but I couldn't take the chance of him knowing I was awake. So I waited, and waited. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally turned and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate. I didn't wait a second longer. I threw the door open, scrambled out of the truck, and ran to wake everyone else up. My friends, who had also been pretending to sleep, were already awake. They had heard the footsteps too. We didn't waste time. We all piled into our vehicles and drove off again. We didn't stop until we were safely back in town, where we called the authorities. They sent someone out to check the area, but by then, the man was long gone. We never camped in that area again. Looking back, I know what happened that night wasn't just a weird coincidence. We were lucky. Whatever that man was doing out there in the desert, it wasn't normal. And even now, whenever I think about it, I can still feel the weight of his gaze, the silence of the desert, and the eerie feeling of being watched, even when I was supposed to be safe. So, if you're ever out camping near Tucson, Arizona, far away from any towns, deep in the desert, maybe think twice. Because there's a lot more out there than just coyotes and mountain lions. And not all of it's wild. I've had my fair share of weird and scary experiences in the woods. I've been backpacking and camping since I was a kid, and I never stopped. There's something about the solitude, the air, the firelight flickering against tree bark that just settles something in me. But over the years, it's also shown me how fast things can go sideways. How nature doesn't care how much you've prepared, how many times you've done this before. And sometimes, it's not nature that's the problem at all. The worst experience I ever had, hands down, was a camping trip with my wife. We'd been planning that one for a few weeks. Nothing too remote, just a weekend in the woods, maybe 10 miles from the highway, not far from a logging road we'd used a few times before. It was deep in jack pine country. For those who don't know, jack pines aren't the strongest trees. Their roots don't go deep. They're tall, scraggly, and they fall fast when the wind decides to come through. They grow tight together too, which only makes it worse. The day we got there, it was calm. Warm, too, unusually warm for that time of year. The sky was overcast but not threatening. I remember we were halfway through setting up when I noticed the treetops shifting a little more than they had been. Nothing crazy, just more motion than I'd expect from the breeze we were feeling at ground level. I thought maybe it was just air moving differently higher up. I didn't think much of it. By sundown, we had the fire going, dinner cooked, and the tent up. I was sitting on a log watching the flames when the wind started picking up hard. Not just a breeze now. It came in heavy gusts, enough to make the fire flicker sideways and scatter ash. My wife and I exchanged a look, but we didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. It was wind. We weren't new to this. We put out the fire properly and climbed into the tent, hoping it would die down by midnight. It didn't. Instead, it got worse. The wind didn't howl, it roared. It pushed and slammed through the trees above us. I laid there in the dark, hands on my chest, listening to what sounded like freight trains smashing through the forest canopy. I don't think my wife slept at all. I know I didn't. The first tree to go came down maybe 100 yards off. You know the sound when a big jack pine snaps in half? It's like someone ripping cloth the size of a house, followed by this deep groaning crack, and then the crash of branches and trunks smashing to the ground. The earth shook under us. After that, it was like dominoes. One tree, then another. Sometimes two at once. The tent was snapping and straining under the gusts, the poles creaking and bending. I kept picturing a tree coming down straight onto us. There was nowhere safe. We were surrounded by them. I kept thinking, asterisk, what if it's the one right next to us? What if it falls sideways and not straight? Asterisk, I thought about making a run for the car, but it was too far. Maybe a quarter-mile away along a narrow, root-tangled trail through the trees. In that wind, suicide. So we laid there, fully dressed, boots on, packs near the door of the tent, just waiting, listening. At some point, maybe around 3 in the morning, it peaked. I don't think I'll ever forget that sound. The way the wind moaned and shrieked, as if it was alive. The trees were swaying so hard I could hear the bark straining. At least 4 or 5 more trees fell around us. Each time it happened, I'd freeze, bracing for the hit that never came. You don't sleep in a storm like that. You endure it. You wait it out. And if you're lucky, the trees pick somewhere else to fall. By dawn, it was over. The silence was eerie. Not peaceful, just empty. The forest was full of cracks and snaps and splinters, but the wind had died off completely. We crawled out of the tent and looked around. The air smelled like raw pine, fresh sap, and dirt. Trees were down everywhere. One had crushed a nearby fire pit. Another had snapped halfway up and was dangling over the trail like a loose limb ready to drop. We packed fast. No coffee, no breakfast, just rolled everything tight and moved. Every step back to the car, I was looking up at the trees, wondering which one might still come down. Even after the wind, some of them looked ready to go. That's the thing about jack pine, weak roots. They lean and hang and wait until the next little breeze finishes the job. I didn't talk much. Neither did my wife. We just kept moving. We didn't go back to that spot again. But that wasn't the only strange thing I've run into out there. Another time, it was just me and my best friend. We'd found this semi-remote camping spot, a place only accessible by 4x4. You wouldn't find it unless you knew it was there. It wasn't maintained, not really. A couple of rusted fire rings, some collapsed picnic tables, and a rundown outhouse that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 90s. The parks people probably checked it once a year. Maybe. We got in early in the day. Weather was fine. No wind, no weird feelings. Just your basic backwoods sight. As we were setting up, my buddy wandered off toward the outhouses. He was gone for a bit, then came back with this weird look on his face and told me to go check out the first stall. I figured something had died in there, or someone had crapped all over the place. I wasn't expecting anything pleasant. When I opened the door, it took a second for my eyes to adjust to the light inside. It didn't smell bad. That was the first surprise. No stink of rot or filth. Just wood, old dust, and a faint plasticky smell. Then I saw them, 3 full-size backpacks, all lined up inside. Big bags. The kind you take for a full week out. They looked almost brand new. I opened them. 2 of them were full of gear. Good gear. Sleeping bags, freeze-dried food, jet boil stove, extra socks, layered clothing, stuff for all kinds of weather. Everything neatly packed. No ID, no wallet, no phones. Nothing personal. The third pack was the weird one. I opened the top and found bags of Skittles. Dozens. Maybe more than 100. Regular size, family packs, little Halloween ones, even the huge Costco-style bulk bags. Tropical, wild berry, original, sour. Every kind they make. It was packed tight with them. No other gear. No clothes. Just Skittles. We stayed 4 days at that site. Never saw a single person. No tire tracks besides ours. No campers, no hikers. Every morning we checked. The bags were still there. Nobody came for them. When we packed up and left, we stopped by the nearest ranger station and told them. Gave them the location, told them about the bags. The guy working there just nodded and wrote it down. We never heard anything back. I still think about that sometimes. Who brings that many Skittles into the woods? Why leave all that gear? Why the outhouse? It didn't feel dangerous, just strange. Like we'd stumbled into someone's unfinished story and never got the ending. But one time, it did feel dangerous. That one was a quick overnight trip, just me and my dog. It was spur of the moment. We didn't go far in, just a few miles off a logging road. I had a small fire going, and a tarp set up as a lean-to. We weren't being secretive, but I wasn't blasting music or hanging lights either. It was just me and the dog, quiet, enjoying the evening. Around midnight, I was half asleep, fire burned down low. My dog was curled up next to me, not even twitching in his sleep. That's when I heard it, a truck somewhere nearby, tearing up the road. Fast. Too fast for that kind of terrain. Then the voices. Drunk. Loud. Slurred. I couldn't see them, but I could hear the yelling, laughter, beer cans cracking open. Then the gunshots started. At first, I thought maybe they were far off, maybe firing into the air. But the more I listened, the more I realized they weren't that far. A quarter mile, maybe less. Close enough that when I ducked down and stared through the trees, I could see faint flashes from the muzzle flare between the branches. Based on the slope of the land, I had this awful feeling they were firing down toward my general direction without knowing I was there. And maybe they wouldn't care if they found out. I didn't waste time. I put the fire out completely, doused it until I could smear ash between my fingers, and it was cold. I packed fast and quiet. My dog, thank God, didn't bark. Just stood close, leash on, ears pinned back. We slipped out the back way, heading downhill, away from the road, staying behind tree cover. No light, no talking, just crunching leaves under my boots and my dog's breath next to me. It took us a few hours to bushwhack back to the car. I came out a mile farther down than where I'd parked. Slept in the driver's seat with the doors locked. Left at first light. That one rattled me, because it reminded me that people are the real danger out there. Storms are one thing. Falling trees, wild animals, they follow patterns. But people? You never know what they're going to do. Drunk guys with guns in the woods at midnight? That's something I never want to cross paths with again. I still go out, but I'm more careful now. I check the lay of the land better. I scout out exit points, pick spots farther from roads. I still bring my tarp sometimes, still light a fire, but I keep a tighter perimeter. And when the wind picks up, I don't wait around to see how bad it gets. All those trips, every single one of them, taught me something. That even when you think you're prepared, the woods have a way of surprising you. Sometimes it's a storm that could have killed you. Sometimes it's a backpack full of Skittles. Sometimes it's the sound of drunk voices and gunfire in the dark. And the only reason I'm still around to tell the stories is because I learned to listen, to trust that bad feeling when it crawls up your spine, to move when you need to, and most of all, to never assume you're alone out there. Because even when you think you are, you might not be. I was just a kid, but I always felt like I had a little more freedom than most kids my age. My parents were awesome in that way. On weekend nights, they let me sleep in the living room, where I could watch TV and stay up as late as I wanted, especially because my sister was a light sleeper and would wake up at the smallest noise. This arrangement worked for everyone. She got her sleep, and I got to stay up until dawn, watching shows that felt just a little too mature for me, but were still the most exciting things on TV. Nick at Night was the channel of choice for me. All those reruns of old sitcoms made the night feel so much more alive. Eventually, I would always end up falling asleep on the couch, though. The shows would blur together, and my eyelids would get heavy, no matter how much I tried to stay awake. It was one of those nights when it happened. I had watched rerun after rerun until my body could no longer stay awake, and I drifted off on the couch, nestled in the cushions. The house was quiet, but there was something about that stillness that made it feel thick with the weight of nighttime. The dogs were quiet, too. It was one of those moments where even the crickets outside seemed to have stopped chirping. Then, I woke up to something strange. It wasn't like being woken by a noise, but more like a prickly feeling on my skin. An instinct that something wasn't right. I don't know how else to explain it. My body just shot into a sitting position on the couch, and I immediately turned my head toward the front window. My heart raced a little, though I couldn't explain why at first. The light outside was soft and eerie, coming from the full moon above, casting a silver glow across the yard and the line of trees that stretched far into the distance. The trees were so thick, so deep, it felt like the woods were endless. And that's when I saw it. A silhouette. A person, standing among the branches of one of the biggest trees, right outside the window. The shape was dark, almost like a shadow, but there was no mistaking the figure. I felt my breath catch in my throat, and I froze. I stared hard, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, and I couldn't tell if it was looking at me or just standing still, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It felt wrong, like it shouldn't be there. Suddenly, our family dog, a big mutt named Buster, shot up from his spot by the front door and dashed straight to the window, barking and snarling like a wild animal. His growls were deep and ferocious, the kind of sound that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I could see his breath fogging up the glass as he clawed at the window, his eyes wide and frantic. Fear shot through me like an electric shock. Without thinking, I jumped up from the couch, my heart pounding in my chest. I rushed down the hall, trying to keep quiet, but my footsteps felt loud in the silence. I threw open the door to my parents' room and burst in, gasping for air as I tried to explain what I had seen. "There's someone outside, in the tree," I stammered, my voice shaky and panicked. I saw them, standing in the tree. The dogs freaking out. My dad stirred awake immediately, his eyes flickering open. I could see the concern in his face as he quickly got out of bed. "Stay here," he said, already reaching for something near his bedside table. I knew it was something defensive. He always kept a bat nearby in case anything ever happened out here in the rural Georgia woods. The night felt so quiet, almost too quiet. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like something is about to break it. He opened the door and motioned for the dogs to follow him. His footsteps were steady as he walked out into the night, disappearing into the shadows with the dogs at his heels. I could hear Buster barking furiously outside, his voice carrying across the stillness. I crawled into bed with my mom, curling up next to her for comfort. I felt like a kid again, even though I was probably a little too old for such things. My mom wrapped her arms around me, trying to soothe me as I shook with fear. My heart wouldn't stop racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there just waiting. Time felt like it stretched on forever. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the tree. Who was it? What were they doing out there? The longer I lay there, the more I began to question myself. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. I wanted to believe that so badly. Eventually, the door creaked open and Dad came back in. His face was hard to read, but I could tell he wasn't thrilled with what he had found. "There's no one out there," he said flatly, like he had seen nothing. "Just the wind, maybe. Go back to bed." I wasn't sure what to think. On one hand, I was relieved. Maybe I had been imagining things. But then, why had Buster been so frantic? Why had I seen that shape in the tree? Something didn't sit right with me, but I was too tired and scared to argue. I nodded, and my mom helped me crawl back into my own bed. She tucked me in, kissed my forehead, and whispered that everything was okay. But I couldn't sleep. Not now. Not with the memory of that silhouette burned into my mind. I glanced over at my sister, still sleeping peacefully in her bed. I didn't want to wake her. She would just get scared too. So, I lay there in the darkness, trying to calm my thoughts. Maybe Dad was right. Maybe it had just been a trick of the mind. The house creaked with the settling of wood, and the silence in the room felt even more oppressive now. I was just about to close my eyes when I saw something, movement outside my window. It was him, the man. I couldn't believe it. I blinked, trying to make sure I wasn't imagining things again. But no, he was still there, standing outside my window, perfectly visible in the moonlight. I could barely make out his shape, but I knew it was him. He was there, watching. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my body frozen in fear. I tried to convince myself that it was another trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. He was there, looking at me. He didn't move at first, but then he did something that made my blood run cold. He raised his finger to his lips in that unmistakable shush gesture. The kind of gesture you make when you want someone to be quiet. He gave it to me as if to say, "Don't make a sound." And then he turned. He just turned and walked away, as if nothing had ever happened. He didn't sneak, didn't hide. He just turned and ran straight away from the house, disappearing into the woods. I lay there, staring at the empty window, my body trembling with fear, but I couldn't bring myself to scream or run. I just cried. I don't know how long I cried. It felt like hours, but eventually, exhaustion took over. I had to sleep. I had no choice. The house was still, and the moonlight outside was gentle, but my mind was in chaos. The next morning, everything seemed fine. The world was bright and peaceful, like nothing had happened at all. Dad made his usual rounds, walking through the house with a cup of coffee, checking locks, and making sure everything was all right. I told myself that it was all just some weird, vivid nightmare. The night felt so real, but maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe I had been too scared, and it had just been my imagination. But it wasn't. The memory of the man outside my window stayed with me. His figure, his gesture, the way he had just disappeared into the woods without a sound. I could still feel the weight of his presence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe. That none of us were. Dad never mentioned it again, and over time, I started to convince myself that maybe he had just been an odd figure, a trick of the light, or someone passing by. But I would never forget that night. That feeling. The way my world had shifted for just a moment and left me with a lingering unease that I couldn't ever quite shake. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I do know that from that night on, I never again felt completely safe in the stillness of the rural Georgia woods. I had been planning a solo weekend in the valley for a while. I'd looked at the map, chosen a remote area not too far from the river, and packed everything I'd need. I wanted some quiet, some distance from the noise of people and the constant hum of the city. It was supposed to be peaceful. No cell service, no emails, no notifications. Just me, some cold beers, the trees, and a fire at night. I had my gear all sorted, my food packed, and even brought a few downloads of a friend's comedy podcast to keep me company. The drive took a few hours. The road snaked down through the hills, into the deep folds of the valley. It was beautiful. The trees still held onto their last bits of green, the river shimmered between them, and the temperature had that crisp, dry edge that told me fall was coming soon. I was late getting to the trailhead. I knew I wouldn't get as far down the trail as I wanted before dark, but I figured I'd at least get a couple miles in, then find a flat spot to throw up my tent. I hiked a bit longer than I should have. The sun was already down past the tops of the trees when I realized I needed to find a place soon. That's when I saw him, just off the side of the trail, leaning on a walking stick, a guy in his mid-40s maybe. Ball cap, long ponytail, flannel shirt. He looked like someone local, maybe one of those people who grew up in these parts and knew every inch of the woods by heart. He smiled and said something about it getting dark quick this time of year. I agreed, trying to hide the edge of anxiety that was starting to creep up on me. He asked if I was looking for a spot to camp, and I nodded. He said he knew of a good one just a short walk away, not far off the road and right next to the river. Said it was kind of hidden but flat, with enough space for a fire. Normally I wouldn't follow someone I'd just met, but something about his tone, the way he carried himself, didn't feel threatening. It was already getting dark, and I didn't have time to search around blindly. I figured if it felt sketchy, I could always get back to the truck. He walked me through a short trail I never would have noticed. It cut between two thick stands of trees, down a small slope, and opened into a little gravel clearing just above the riverbank. There was a flat patch of ground ringed with old stones for a fire pit and a decent amount of cover from the road. Couldn't see the trail or anything. It was tucked away just enough to feel like a little secret. He told me it was one of his favorite spots when he came fishing. Then he waved, said to enjoy the evening, and walked off without another word. I built up a small fire, cracked a beer, and started cooking a little dinner on my backpacking stove. I was loud. I know I was. I had the comedy podcast on speaker, and I laughed harder than I probably should have being out there alone. Something about being away from everything made it feel okay to just be noisy. No one was around. It felt safe. Wide open sky, river sounds, and the comfort of my truck just a few steps away. I thought about putting up the tent, but I was tired. The idea of dragging out the poles, pounding in stakes, and setting everything up in the dark just didn't sound worth it. My truck had a topper, and I'd already thrown a foam pad and my sleeping bag back there. Everything I needed was in arm's reach. So I just crawled into the back, shut the topper, left the windows cracked, and passed out not long after the fire burned down. It was one of those nights where you don't remember falling asleep. I was just out. No weird sounds, no dreams, just dark and quiet. I woke up early, maybe a little before 7. The sun was just starting to warm up the tops of the trees. Everything was still damp and cold, and the river was steaming slightly. I stretched, opened the back of the truck, and stepped out. It felt like a good morning. I started the fire back up, threw a pan on a rock nearby, cracked a beer, because I was on vacation and didn't care what time it was, and started cooking some eggs and sausage. My boots were still cold, my hands were stiff, but the fire helped. I was sipping from the can, waiting for the pan to heat up, when I noticed something. Movement. Not big, just enough to catch my eye. Off at the edge of the trees, near where the trail cuts down. At first, I thought it might be a deer or something, but it wasn't. There was a man standing there. He wasn't looking at me, just kind of there, half behind a tree, with his head turned off to the side like he was studying something else. He didn't move much, but I could see him breathing. His chest rose and fell fast, like he'd been walking or was cold. He had this long, ratty beard, gray and matted, and what looked like 100 plastic grocery bags tied to him. I mean it, bags everywhere, hanging off his sleeves, from his belt, even tied into his pants and shirt. They rustled every time he moved. It was like a full outfit made of trash. He slowly stepped closer to the edge of the clearing. Still didn't look at me. Didn't say anything. I tried to be normal. I didn't want to freak him out or make things tense, so I called out something about how nice the morning was. Just small talk. But he didn't respond. Didn't even twitch. He stood there for a while. Then he started this slow pacing along the edge of the trees. Not walking straight toward me, just circling the camp, kind of like how a dog might do when it's unsure of something. He'd stop, breathe loudly through his nose, then shuffle a few more feet. The bags on his clothes crinkled and rustled with every movement. I tried again. Said I had plenty of breakfast if he wanted some. Still nothing. He wasn't pretending to ignore me. It was like I didn't even exist to him. That made my stomach twist a bit. I didn't like how close he was. I didn't like that he didn't look me in the eye. I offered him a beer. I even lifted the can and waved it a little, like some kind of peace offering. He didn't say anything. He didn't shake his head or wave me off. He just turned his back to me and stood there, about 20 feet away, right on the edge of the trees. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be a good thing. My gut had been trying to tell me for a while, but now it was loud. There was no reason for him to be there. Nuteng, nupeki, nufishing hod, nugir. Just him, the bags, and that weird pacing. And the silence. Always the silence. I wasn't afraid in the horror movie sense. I was afraid in the real, sharp-edged, get-out-now way. I started checking where my stuff was. My bear spray was on the tailgate. My knife was inside the back of the truck, just next to my sleeping bag. Everything else was scattered: cooler, stove, bag of food, clothes. But I started mentally packing it all. He hadn't moved, just stood there with his back to me. I said, in the firmest voice I could manage, that he needed to either acknowledge me or leave right now. I didn't shout. I didn't want to escalate things, but I needed to draw a line. Still nothing. Didn't even flinch. I picked up the bear spray, took a couple of steps toward him. That got a reaction. He didn't turn around or speak. He just started sulking off through the trees. That weird slow movement, the rustle of the plastic bags fading as he slipped into the woods. I watched him the whole time. Didn't look away. I kept the bear spray in my hand, even after he was gone. I didn't waste another second. I stomped out the fire, threw the pan into the truck bed still greasy, dumped the beer, and started tossing everything in, half-packed, just shoved and stacked. I didn't care if stuff spilled or got smashed. I wanted out. My heart was hammering, and I couldn't stop checking over my shoulder. I pulled out of the clearing so fast I scraped a low-hanging branch across the roof of my truck. I didn't care. I got back to the road, took a deep breath, and drove until I had 2 bars of service and could see a gas station. I sat there in the lot for a long time. Just sat with the truck running. I kept thinking back to the night before. I'd been loud, visible, fire going, laughing, beer cans clinking. Anyone within 100 yards would have known exactly where I was. I kept thinking about that guy. Had he been watching me all night? Was he in the trees when I crawled into the back of the truck? That thought made me feel sick. If I had put up the tent, I wouldn't have heard him approach. I wouldn't have known if he was close. But I'd slept in the truck. Everything was locked but the back, and I was surrounded by gear, and I had that little can of bear spray right next to my pillow. That laziness, the choice to not set up camp properly, might have saved me. I don't know what he wanted. He didn't seem drunk. He didn't seem high. He just wasn't right. I didn't go back to the valley. I deleted the GPS mark for that spot. I don't care how hidden it was, or how nice the river sounded at night. I can still hear those plastic bags in the wind sometimes. Still picture him standing there, unmoving, like a tree that didn't belong. I camped alone again eventually, but never without a second thought. Never without a weapon in reach. And I always checked the edges of the trees. That morning changed something in me. It reminded me how close the wild really is. Not just the woods, not the animals, but the people who live beyond the lines. People who don't care about rules or comfort or making sense. That man didn't need a reason to stand there. And I didn't need a reason to leave. I've never told anyone the full version. Just said I had a weird run-in and decided to pack it up. But it stuck with me. That look or lack of it. That silence. The rustle of bags. The feeling that someone had been just out of view while I slept, not 20 feet away, waiting for something. I don't think I'll ever know what. And I don't want to. It was supposed to be a family vacation. We were going to spend Christmas somewhere special, a quiet cabin in the mountains. It was supposed to be the kind of trip where you could just get away from everything, forget about the stresses of life for a bit, and just focus on each other. My parents were always talking about it, how it was going to be the perfect holiday to make up for all the crazy stuff that had been happening lately. But somewhere between the excitement and the packing, they forgot something. They forgot me. I had been waiting at the house for hours, thinking they'd be back any minute. Christmas was coming up, and I was looking forward to it. The smell of fresh pine from the tree, the warm feeling of family all together, the presents. But when they didn't show up, I started to feel uneasy. I was a teenager, so I could handle being alone for a little while, but as the minutes stretched into hours, it got weird. There was no phone call, no explanation, just silence. Eventually, I called my mom. No answer. I left a message, but still nothing. I figured maybe they were stuck in traffic or had gotten held up at the last minute. But as the day went on, I started to get an inkling that something wasn't right. It wasn't until later, around midnight, that I realized the truth. They had gone without me. Completely. No explanation. No, hey, sorry we forgot you. Nothing. Just the house, me, and the empty feeling of being forgotten. But this was only the beginning. Later that night, as I was pacing around the house, trying to shake off the feelings of being abandoned, I noticed something strange. The sound of a car engine, then another. I looked out the window and saw two cars parked down the street, both of them hidden in the shadows of the trees. They weren't parked in any official spot. These were two vehicles that looked like they were trying to blend in. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes people park down the street for all sorts of reasons. But then I saw two figures move toward the house. They didn't knock. They didn't ring the doorbell. They didn't do anything that normal people would do. They just crept around to the back of the house, which was odd. Most people would have walked up the front steps. But these guys, they knew exactly what they were doing. It didn't take me long to figure out what was going on. I wasn't stupid. These two men weren't lost. They weren't here to visit family or friends. They were here for something else. They were here to rob the place. Now, most people would have panicked, called the cops, tried to get out of the house. But I didn't. Panic wasn't an option. I'd been alone for so long. My mind had been running on empty and filled with bad ideas, bad thoughts. But this was something I could handle. The first thing I did was go into the garage. It was still dark, but I knew exactly where to look. I found the flamethrower. Don't ask me why we had one. My dad had gotten it as a joke one Christmas a few years ago. I guess it seemed like a cool idea at the time. I had no idea if it was working, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going to let these guys get close enough to find out. I had to be prepared for anything. I went to the back door, stood there for a second, trying to figure out what I was going to do. The flamethrower was my last line of defense, but I didn't want to use it unless I had to. I thought about calling the cops, but then I remembered they'd take forever to get here. The nearest station was 20 minutes away, and I wasn't sure how much time I had. So, I started making plans. I could hear them moving around outside, and I knew they were trying to figure out how to get in. The first thing I did was grab a handful of small toys, Legos, a couple of old plastic soldiers, a bouncing ball, anything that I could scatter across the floor. I didn't know why I thought it would work, but I knew the noise would be loud enough to make them hesitate. If they tried to sneak in, they'd step on something, and I could hear them. It was something. Next, I went to the kitchen and grabbed a few kitchen knives, anything that I could use to defend myself. I didn't want to just wait for them to come inside and catch me off guard. I needed to be prepared. As I was doing this, I could hear the back door creak open. The men were inside. They were close. I froze. One of the men must have tripped over one of the toys I left out because I heard the unmistakable sound of plastic crunching underfoot. I felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it. I quickly moved to the hallway, positioned myself between the kitchen and the stairs. The plan was simple. If they came through the kitchen, I would be waiting. I figured I'd use the knives, maybe even the flamethrower if they got too close. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, cautious, like they were testing every step, afraid to make a sound. I could feel my heart beating faster as they moved through the house, getting closer to me. The tension in the air was thick, like the entire house was holding its breath. It was like they knew I was there, but they couldn't find me. I couldn't just stand there. I had to act. I grabbed the flamethrower and aimed it at the back door, which was just a few feet away. It was almost like I could hear the men whispering, talking to each other. They thought they had the upper hand, but they didn't know I had the element of surprise. I was ready to strike, and when that door opened, I wasn't going to hesitate. It felt like forever before it finally happened. The door opened, and I hit the trigger. Flames erupted from the nozzle, and I saw the two men scramble backward. One of them dropped something, probably a weapon, before he ducked down to avoid the fire. I didn't care if I burned something. I wasn't going to let these guys hurt me. I kept the flames aimed at the door, forcing them to stay back. They didn't expect that. I heard them curse, scrambling away from the fire. But that wasn't enough. I knew they were still out there. They weren't giving up that easily. I switched to plan B. I started making noise. I kicked over a trash can, banged pots and pans together. Anything I could do to make it seem like I was coming from different places in the house. I wanted to confuse them, make them second-guess their plan. It worked. The men were disoriented. They started moving faster, making mistakes. One of them tripped and fell on the Legos I'd left out, and I heard him swear loudly as he hit the floor. That was my chance. I grabbed another knife and ran toward the stairs. I knew the layout of the house better than they did. They wouldn't expect me to be upstairs. I crept up the stairs, careful not to make a sound. The two men were still moving around downstairs, probably trying to figure out what had happened. They had no idea where I was. But I was ready. I wasn't going to let them win. I grabbed the cordless phone from the hallway and dialed 911, keeping my voice low so they wouldn't hear me. I told them there were 2 intruders in my house and gave them my address. I didn't know if they would get here in time, but it was all I could do. I didn't stop moving. I was alert, watching every corner of the house, ready for the next move. I kept listening to the sounds of the men moving below, and eventually, I heard sirens. They were close. The men must have heard them too. They started to panic. One of them rushed toward the front door, and the other tried to make a run for the back. But before they could get far, the cops arrived. It was over. The cops pulled up to the house, and I saw the 2 men being handcuffed, taken away in the back of a squad car. It had all happened so fast. My family showed up minutes later, just as the cops were leaving. They had no idea what had happened, no clue about the chaos that had unfolded in their absence. They were confused at first, asking me why the cops were there. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The whole situation was still too fresh in my mind. All I knew was that I had handled it. I had kept myself safe. And in the end, that's all that mattered. We had been doing these hikes every few weeks that fall. It started as a way to get away from everything, work, noise, phones, all of it. The deeper we could get into the woods, the better we felt. Georgia has some amazing trail systems if you know where to look, and we'd found one spot off an old forest road that looked like nobody had touched it in years. The trail wasn't even marked, but someone had clearly cleared it a long time ago. It wove deep into the hardwoods, dipping into creek beds, climbing out into ridges, then slipping back under thick pine canopies. It felt untouched, quiet in that way that makes your skin buzz. That weekend was supposed to be just another regular hike. 3 of us had Friday off, so we hit the trailhead just after noon. By the time we reached our spot, about 5 miles in, the light was already shifting. The trees were in full fall colors, but everything looked tired, like it was bracing for something. We set up camp near a small clearing just off the trail. There was a half-collapsed fire ring made from river rocks, the kind you only find deep into the woods where no one's tried to make it cute. The air was cold, not biting yet, but sharper than it should have been. We figured it'd dip into the 40s, maybe high 30s, which wasn't unusual for mid-fall in Georgia. We had the gear for it. Nothing fancy, but warm enough if we stayed dry and kept a fire going. By the time we had the tents pitched and the fire crackling, the sky had gone this deep slate gray, not stormy, just heavy. We cooked over the fire, simple stuff, beans, rice, some sausage we brought. The fire danced under the big limbs above us, throwing shadows so thick and long it looked like something was always moving. After dinner, we sat around for a bit, not saying much. The fire did the talking. The wind started to pick up sometime after 10. Sharp, bitter gusts that tore through the trees and made the flames hiss. We fed the fire steadily until the woodpile was about halfway gone, then let it burn down into a hot, glowing bed. I remember sitting back against my pack, jacket zipped up tight, feeling full and warm and safe. That kind of peace only comes out there, deep in the woods with nothing but the dark. I drifted off without realizing it. The cold had sunk lower than we thought. I woke up once to turn over, and my breath came out like smoke. I zipped my bag higher and tucked in tighter. The fire was still glowing red behind my eyelids. I was just starting to slip back under when I felt something hit my foot. Not hard, just enough to pull me out of that in-between space. I opened my eyes and saw my buddy standing over me. He wasn't saying anything, just holding a stick, the tip resting lightly on my boot. I blinked at him, still halfway in a dream, then looked past him toward the fire. There were 2 wild boars near the fire pit. One was a few feet from the coals, pawing at the ground, rooting around in the ash like it was looking for food. The other stood off to the side, its body half hidden in the shadows, but I could see its back rise and fall like a pump jack. They were big, bigger than I'd expected, thick bodies low to the ground, covered in bristled hair that looked coarse and matted in the dim light. Their snouts moved constantly, sniffing, digging, testing the air. My friend didn't move. I didn't either. I didn't even sit up, just laid there in my sleeping bag, the warmth now replaced with something sharp and cold in my chest. Every breath I took felt loud. Too loud. The boar near the fire stopped and looked around, snout twitching. I didn't even blink. We didn't have anything. A hand axe, but it was stuck in a log we'd been splitting earlier, about 10 feet away. No guns, no blades, nothing that'd make a difference if those things charged. These weren't cartoon pigs. They were wild, mean animals. You don't realize how serious that is until you're face to face with one. Their shoulders were like boulders, and their eyes, even in the firelight, looked flat and hard, like nothing behind them but muscle and instinct. I stayed frozen. My buddy slowly crouched down, not back in his bag, but low to the ground, trying to make himself smaller. He kept glancing at me, then at the boars, like we were thinking the same thing. Don't move, don't make a sound, don't become a threat. The one closer to the fire gave a grunt, low and raspy, then jabbed its snout into the dirt again, kicking up ash and half-burnt wood. A spark jumped into the air and died before it landed. I remember watching that spark, tiny and bright, and gone just as quick, and thinking how close we were to being in real danger. Time started to bend. At some point I couldn't tell if it had been 5 minutes or 30. I was cold, not just outside, but deep in my limbs, in my chest. Every part of me screamed to shiver, but I fought it. The fire was burning low, now just a smolder, and the boars seemed to lose interest, but not entirely. They milled around, sniffing our packs, brushing against one of the tents, snorting at nothing. One of them suddenly jolted, darting forward a few feet before stopping. I thought it had seen me, that it was about to charge. But it didn't. It just stood there, head low, ears flicking. The other one moved to its side, and together they just waited, watching something we couldn't see. Not us. Off in the woods. We stayed still. I could feel the sweat on my back, freezing under the layers. My eyes were dry from not blinking. My knees ached from how stiff I'd gone, but I didn't dare move. Eventually, the boars turned and slowly walked off, one after the other, heading back into the woods. No rush, no fear, just gone. We didn't move for a long time after that. The fire had almost died completely. Just a faint orange heart of heat left in the pit. The wind kept coming in long, cold waves, cutting through our camp and rattling the leaves overhead. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore. No snorts, no hooves on the forest floor. Then I slowly sat up, joints stiff, muscles aching like I'd run a marathon. My friend stood too, stretching out, rubbing his arms. Still no words. There was nothing to say. We didn't need to talk about it. We both knew how close that had been. We spent the next hour feeding the fire again, getting it back to a proper flame, staying close, keeping our eyes on the tree line. Every noise in the woods made us jump. Every crack of a twig sounded like a charge. Sleep didn't come easy after that. The temperature dropped even lower. I don't know how cold it got, but it was enough to make our breath hang thick in the air, even as the sun started to rise. The fire helped, but not much. We didn't say much the next morning. Just packed up slowly, checked the edge of camp for signs of the boars. We found a few deep hoof prints near where my buddy had been sleeping, and torn up earth around the fire ring. We hiked out early. The trail felt longer on the way back. Every turn in the path felt like it could reveal something waiting. The woods were too quiet. The leaves barely moved. It was like everything had held its breath. Back at the truck, we finally exhaled. Threw our packs in the bed, and sat for a long while before starting it up. That heater never felt better. As we pulled back onto the road, the woods swallowed the trailhead behind us like it had never been there. I still think about that night, about how lucky we were. People talk about wild animals like they're just background to camping. Something you might see at a distance, maybe snap a picture of. But they're real. They're dangerous. And sometimes, you're just a breath away from them. I don't scare easy. I've been in storms, bad falls, even been lost once for half a day. But nothing stuck with me like those boars. The weight of them, the silence, the way they didn't care we were there, just moved through like they owned the place. Because they did. We were the guests. And that night, we were lucky not to get kicked out the hard way. My family went camping every summer when I was a kid. It was sort of a tradition, not anything fancy, just the kind of old-school trips where you pile everything into the car, hit a grocery store on the way, and spend the week cooking over a camp stove and getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. Most of the time, we bounced around between Virginia Beach, Assateague Island, and a place I hated called Westmoreland. Out of all of them, Assateague had the best and worst of everything. beautiful ocean views and wild ponies wandering around like they owned the place. Which, to be fair, they kind of did. The trip I'm thinking of happened when I was around 9 or 10. I'm not totally sure how old I was, but I remember being small enough that I still got scared easily. That summer we were back at Assateague, and I was pumped. There was something magical about that place when you're a kid. The sand dunes, the salty breeze coming off the Atlantic, the ponies that wandered between tents like they were part of the campground. I didn't know yet how weird and creepy things could feel in the middle of the night. We had 2 tents set up that time. One was for me and my mom, and the other was a few yards away for my dad and siblings. I'm not sure why we split it up that way. Maybe it was because my dad snored like a diesel engine, or maybe because I was the youngest and my mom didn't want to leave me alone. Either way, our tent was closer to the beach trail, half nestled under some gnarled pine trees and half in the open, just on the edge of a sandy path that led straight to the dunes. The day had been hot, and even though the evening cooled down a little, the humidity clung to everything like a second skin. The tent smelled like sweat and salt and sunscreen, and the cheap sleeping bags stuck to our legs no matter how many times we rolled over. I remember tossing and turning, trying to find a spot where the air moved, but nothing helped. Outside, the sounds of the campground drifted in, voices from other families, the occasional whoop of kids who didn't want to go to bed, the metallic pop of a fire pit cooling down. Somewhere, someone was playing music softly, something old and folksy that barely reached us through the trees. Eventually, the noise settled. People went to bed. The only sounds left were the hiss of bugs and the crash of waves in the distance. I must have finally fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange stillness. Not quiet exactly. There were still the bugs in the ocean, but something else felt off. I opened my eyes and saw my mom sitting up straight in her sleeping bag, completely still. The moonlight was filtering through the thin walls of the tent, and I could just make out her face. Her eyes were locked on the far side of the tent wall, the part facing the trail. She didn't say anything. She wasn't shaking me or whispering or moving at all, just sitting there, staring. That's what made it creepy. Even half asleep, I knew something was weird. I sat up, the sleeping bag catching around my knees, and followed her gaze. The side of the tent was pushed in slightly, like something was leaning against it, and through the mesh window, I saw the shape of a person. Or at least I thought it was a person. It looked like an old woman. That was the first thing that hit me. The silhouette had this long, wiry hair that sort of floated around her head, and she was standing so close that the tip of her nose, or whatever it was nearly touching the fabric. I couldn't see her eyes, but I knew she was looking in at us. My stomach dropped, and for a second I just stared, trying to make sense of it. The figure didn't move, just stood there, slightly hunched, as if peering in. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone from another campsite. Maybe they got turned around and thought our tent was theirs. Maybe it was someone looking for help. But none of it made sense. Who would be wandering around at that hour? And why would they just stand there like that? I was frozen. I didn't want to look away in case it moved. I didn't want to breathe too loud. But the fear got to me, and I said something. I don't remember exactly what, maybe just a whisper asking what it was or who was outside. As soon as I spoke, the figure jerked back. The whole silhouette shifted, and suddenly it wasn't an old woman. It wasn't even a person. There was this sharp, heavy sound as it took off, a sort of huffing breath, and the pounding of hooves in the sand. The shape blurred into movement, and we both scrambled to unzip the tent door. By the time we got it open and stuck our heads out, we saw it, a pony, trotting down the path toward the beach. Its long mane was tangled and messy, catching the moonlight in a way that had looked like old hair. Its body had been blocking the moonlight, casting that eerie shape against our tent. My mom let out this long breath like she'd been holding it the whole time. I just sat there in the doorway of the tent, shaking. I hadn't even realized how scared I was until it was gone. That shape, the way it had just stood there without a sound, it had looked so human. Too human. But now I could see the trail clearly. The sandy path had hoof prints all over it, deep and fresh. We'd unknowingly pitched our tent right along one of the trails the ponies used to go down to the beach. They were used to walking that path at night, probably heading to the dunes to sleep or cool off by the water. We sat up for a while after that, listening. A few other campers must have seen the ponies too, because I heard someone far off yell something and a dog barked. But the rest of the night passed without anything else happening. Eventually, I laid back down, though I didn't really sleep. I kept thinking about how close that animal had come, how quietly it had approached, how human it had looked in the moonlight. The next morning, we told my dad what had happened. He walked the trail and pointed out the hoof prints to my siblings. The ranger station near the entrance had a whole board explaining the feral ponies and their habits. Don't feed them, don't touch them, don't get in their way. They wandered the campground freely. That was part of the appeal for some people, I guess. But after that night, I couldn't see them the same way. I still thought they were beautiful animals, but something about how easily one had crept up on us, how silently it had appeared, and how close it had come without us knowing, it unsettled me. We moved the tent the next night. My mom picked a spot further from the trail, closer to where my dad and the others were camped. I didn't argue. I didn't want to be near that path again. During the day, I could laugh about it, sort of. We joked about ghost ponies, and my mom teased me for thinking it was an old woman. But at night, I kept one ear open, listening for hooves in the sand. Even now, all these years later, I still remember that shape against the tent wall. That long, floating hair. That awful stillness. How it didn't move until I did. I've been camping a lot since then in plenty of places, and I've run into bears, raccoons, deer, even a wild hog once. But nothing ever scared me quite like that pony in the night. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't even aggressive. It had just been passing through, doing what it always did. But there was something about how it stood there, silent and unblinking, that has stayed with me. I guess it taught me that sometimes, even the things you think are harmless can still unsettle you. That fear doesn't always come from monsters or violence. It can come from misunderstanding something so completely that your brain fills in the blanks with something much worse. We still laugh about it now, whenever the family gets together and someone brings up acetate. But every time I hear hooves or see a shadow move in the moonlight, part of me still goes back to that tent, that night, and the moment I thought something not quite human was staring back at me. When I was about 10 years old, my cousins and siblings were all over at my house for a family gathering. I can't even remember exactly why, but there were about 10 of us there, all of us excited because the parents and grandparents were out for an adult dinner, which meant we were on our own. The house was filled with that chaotic energy that only a group of kids can create, running around, yelling, and just enjoying the rare freedom of being unsupervised. It was late, so we ended up in the living room watching a few movies. The TV was playing some animated film, but no one was really paying attention. We were all too busy talking, messing around, and just enjoying the quiet that comes with having the house to ourselves. The living room had large windows that opened out into the backyard, and beyond that, a big field that led to the woods. Our house was in a somewhat rural area, far enough away from neighbors that we had plenty of space to run around and explore. It was one of those houses that had a back porch that overlooked the yard, with nothing but trees stretching out into the horizon. It was peaceful most of the time, which made what happened next all the more jarring. Out of nowhere, the house suddenly shook. It was like the ground itself had jolted upward, throwing everything into confusion. The walls trembled, the floor buckled beneath us, and the air was thick with the sound of a heavy, low boom that seemed to reverberate through our bones. The house felt as though it might collapse at any moment. It was so sudden and intense that for a second, we all just froze, eyes wide, barely able to comprehend what was happening. Then came the flash, bright and blinding, as though someone had lit off a massive flare or an explosion had gone off right outside. The light was so stark and white that it left spots in my vision for a few moments afterward. The moment the shake and flash subsided, we all leaped to our feet, a sense of dread creeping into our bones. The room was silent for just a beat, but then it erupted with noise as every one of us began shouting and running. We didn't even know where we were running to. We just knew we had to get away from whatever that was. As a pack, we rushed down the hallway, huddling together at the far end near the kitchen. Some of the older cousins, the ones who were maybe a couple of years older than me, took charge, but none of us really knew what to do. Our hearts were pounding in our chests, the fear making our heads spin. One of the older cousins suggested calling the police, but there was hesitation in the group. We were all so shaken that none of us really wanted to make that call. What if they thought we were making it up? What if they thought we were just being dramatic? So instead, they decided to call our parents, but all we could do was wait and listen, hoping for some sign that whatever had happened wasn't as bad as it seemed. But there was no sign. No phone calls back, no lights coming on outside. The house felt unnaturally still after the chaos had passed. We stayed in that hallway for what felt like hours, but I'm sure it was only a few minutes. Every time the silence settled in, the terror would rush back in waves. I could hear the faint sound of my younger cousins crying in the corner, clutching onto each other for dear life, their faces pale with fear. Some of us were shaking, others just staring at the door, expecting something, anything to happen. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that we just heard a loud noise from outside, maybe a car backfiring or something like that. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. That wasn't the sound we had just heard. After what felt like an eternity, the decision was made to go back into the living room. We had to see if anything was wrong. At that point, I think we were all so scared of the unknown that the fear of going back into the room seemed less terrifying than the thought of waiting in that hallway forever. One of the older cousins grabbed a broomstick as a weapon, another took a heavy flashlight. We didn't know what we were preparing for, but we were ready for something. Everyone in the group felt like they had to be on guard, like we had to watch our backs just in case something else was lurking around. We cautiously walked back into the living room, but everything looked completely normal. The TV was still playing some movie, the couch cushions were all where they should be. There was no sign of any explosion or damage. The back door was still locked, and the windows were intact. The backyard was as still as it had always been. No fire, no strange debris, nothing to explain the flash. For a while, it seemed like we were all imagining things. Maybe we were just so scared that our brains had played tricks on us. But then again, the shaking, it had felt too real. It had been impossible to ignore. We all stood in that room, looking at each other, trying to figure out what had just happened. The more we thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. There were no loud noises beyond that flash. There were no crashing sounds, no car engines, nothing to explain the vibration in the house. There was nothing unusual outside either. The grass was undisturbed, and there was no sign of any fire or damage. In fact, the only thing we could all agree on was that something huge had just happened, but there was absolutely no evidence of it. About a half hour later, the parents returned. They didn't seem nearly as concerned as we thought they would be. In fact, they seemed downright confused. When we tried to explain what had happened, they just looked at us like we were exaggerating. "It's just your imagination," they said, chuckling as they unloaded groceries from the car. But none of us were laughing. None of us were convinced. No one else in the neighborhood had reported anything strange either. No one had heard the blast. No one had seen any strange lights. The police were never called, and the night ended without anyone truly investigating what had happened. The parents thought we were just scared kids, imagining things, and that was the end of it as far as they were concerned. But to this day, that moment haunts me. The flash, the shaking, the feeling that something enormous had just happened outside that no one could explain. Even though nothing was found, we all knew something had happened. We still talk about it to this day, trying to figure out what could have caused it. No one has any answers. Maybe it was a malfunction with something, a transformer blowing, or a far-off explosion we couldn't hear or see clearly. Maybe it was something more sinister, something no one ever talked about. But even 10 years later, I can't forget how it felt, how the ground shook beneath my feet, how the light blinded me, and how, after it was over, there was nothing but confusion and fear in its wake. That night has been the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and I still don't have any answers. Sometimes I think back to it and wonder if the whole thing was just a fluke, or if it was something we'll never fully understand. But one thing is for sure, it was real, and whatever it was, it left all of us shaken, our minds racing to fill in the blanks with explanations that made sense. But even now, all these years later, we don't have one. I was about 8 years old when this happened, and at the time, my brother and I were still getting used to the idea of our parents leaving us with our grandparents. My sister had always been the responsible one, the oldest of us three, and she was old enough to stay at home when my parents needed to take care of things, like the special doctor's visits for her mental health. They had to take her all the way up to New York City for one of those appointments. It was one of those trips where they would leave for the whole weekend, and that always left me and my brother alone at Grandma and Grandpa's house. I remember it was a Friday afternoon when they dropped us off. My brother and I were already excited, not because we particularly loved being there, but because it meant that we could stay up later than usual. Grandma and Grandpa were both in their 70s by then, and they always went to bed early. They were set in their ways, early to bed, early to rise. That left us with the house to ourselves at night, at least for a few hours. Our grandparents lived in an old two-story house on the outskirts of town. The house had a lot of creaky wooden floors and a musty smell that seemed to come from every corner. We'd spent weekends there before, but we were never able to do anything fun, mainly because Grandma always wanted us to play board games or do something wholesome. But this time we had a plan. The plan was simple: sneak into Grandpa's bedroom, where he no longer slept, and watch TV shows we weren't allowed to watch at home. Shows like The X-Files or Unsolved Mysteries. Things that gave us the chills, but also made us feel like we were doing something rebellious. It was a perfect opportunity, and we didn't want to waste it. The whole house seemed to settle down by around 9 p.m. We'd heard the familiar sound of Grandpa's old recliner chair creaking as he fell asleep in the living room, and Grandma was in her room snoring away. My brother and I crept down the long hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible. The house was so quiet that we could hear our own breathing and the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. We'd made it to Grandpa's bedroom door when we heard a noise from inside. The bed was creaking. At first, we thought it was the cats. Grandma had 4 of them. They were old, scruffy things, always lounging around the house, often making strange noises in the night. We thought nothing of it and assumed that the cats had jumped up onto the bed. My brother, being the more curious one, reached for the door and pushed it open. He paused for a second, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. I, standing right behind him, leaned in to take a look. And that's when we saw it, Grandma and Grandpa, lying in the bed, in a position I had never, ever expected to see them in. They were spooning, yes, but not in the way I imagined a normal hug would look like. No, this was much more intimate, much more disturbing. I could see their old, wrinkled bodies pressed against each other, and the movement of their bodies made a sound I can never forget. The creaking of the bed was replaced by a soft, unsettling slapping sound that made my stomach turn. I remember feeling an immediate rush of confusion and embarrassment. It was one of those moments where your brain can't quite process what it's seeing. My brother stood there for a second, just staring, unsure of what to do. He must have been feeling the same mix of shock and confusion, because neither of us could say anything. The noise, the sight of it, it was all too much for an 8-year-old to handle. We both turned and bolted down the hallway, as quietly as we could, but I could still hear my heart racing in my chest. We ran back to the living room and sat down on the couch, both of us in complete silence. I remember that my legs felt like jelly. The image of my grandparents in that bed, like that, stuck with me for a long time. We didn't tell anyone what we had seen. There was no way to explain it, not to anyone who would understand. What could we even say? We were just kids, and this was something that didn't belong in our world of Saturday cartoons and playing outside. It was something private, too private, and for whatever reason, it felt like it was our fault, like we had violated something that shouldn't have been touched. That night, as we lay in bed, I kept hearing the sound of the bed creaking in my mind. It was stuck there, looping over and over again. I couldn't sleep, not because I was scared, but because my mind was filled with the image of my grandparents, their bodies in that position, and the disturbing noises. The next morning, things were different. My brother and I tried to act normal, as if nothing had happened. We played outside, went for a walk in the backyard, and did everything we usually did when we were at Grandma's. But it felt wrong. The house felt different, like the walls knew what we had seen. Even the cats seemed to be avoiding us, slinking away when we walked past. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed in some way I didn't understand. We didn't talk about what we had seen for years, not even when we were older and able to laugh at the awkwardness of the situation. But to this day, I can still picture it vividly. The way my grandparents looked, the sound of their movements, the feeling of being an intruder in something that should have been left behind closed doors. It wasn't scary in the way a ghost or monster would be, but it was a kind of fear I hadn't expected to encounter at that age. A fear of seeing something I wasn't ready for. We never spoke about it again, not even after Grandma and Grandpa passed away. But it lingered with me, that feeling of crossing a line that shouldn't have been crossed. Looking back, I realized just how young I was, too young to understand that kind of intimacy, too young to know that grown-ups had lives outside of their role as grandparents. But the image never left me, and I don't think it ever will. As the years went on, I sometimes found myself thinking about that night. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget it. The sound, the sight, the realization that we're all human, no matter how old we get. And then years later, as I got older, I would sometimes wonder, do my own parents have their own secret moments? Are they doing the same thing, in the same way? It's a thought that sometimes creeps in, uninvited, and no matter how hard I try, I can never completely shake it. Maybe that's the lesson I learned that night, that there are things in life, things in families, that you just can't unsee. A few summers ago, I decided to go on a bike ride around midnight with a friend. It was one of those warm nights where the air felt thick, but not too hot. There was this calm in the air, almost eerie, as the world seemed to be quietly suspended in the middle of a deep, quiet night. We had spent the evening riding around, chatting about random things, enjoying the peace of the late hour. By the time we parted ways, it was nearly 1 a.m. I still had a couple blocks to ride back home, but I didn't mind. It was just one of those nights where the usual noises of the city, the traffic, the chatter of people, were absent, and all that remained was the faint hum of the streetlights and the cool breeze against my skin. I had to ride on the sidewalk because of construction on the road, but it wasn't a problem. The streets were practically empty, which made sense since it was so late. As I cruised along, I could feel the weight of the quiet surrounding me. The only sounds were the soft hum of my bike tires on the pavement and the occasional distant rumble of traffic from the highway a few blocks away. It was the kind of peaceful silence that made you feel like you were the only person alive in the world. But that peacefulness, that calm, was about to be shattered. As I was approaching the turn onto my street, I noticed a man walking along the sidewalk ahead of me. He was in his 40s, a little scruffy looking, but not homeless. His clothes were a bit worn, but not ragged. He didn't seem out of place, but something about him immediately felt off. Maybe it was the way he moved, like he was in his own world, not paying attention to his surroundings. Or maybe it was just the timing. There was no one else around at this hour, and I didn't expect to see anyone, especially walking alone. The sidewalk I was on was narrow, and I didn't want to startle him. I could tell I was coming up on him pretty fast, so I shouted, "Hey, behind you," as I got about 6 feet away. The words felt awkward as soon as I said them, but I didn't want to just ride up on him and make him freak out. He turned around when I spoke, and at first I didn't think much of it. But then he looked at me with this expression, pure anger. His face twisted into something I can't even describe accurately. He glared at me like I had just insulted him, like I was some kind of enemy. I froze for a second, but I didn't think much of it at the time. It was late, people were tired. Maybe he was just cranky. I quickly turned down my street, not thinking about it too much, just ready to get home and out of the weird encounter. But then, as I was about to reach my house, I heard it. He started yelling, "You fucking cunt. I'll fucking kill you." The words echoed in the night air, sharp and full of venom. I could feel the bile rise in my throat, and my heart started pounding in my chest. His voice didn't fade away. He was coming after me. I looked over my shoulder as I pedaled harder, my mind racing. He was getting closer. I knew I had to do something. My house was just a couple doors down, but I didn't want him to know where I lived. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with this guy. His words weren't just random insults. There was something behind them, a deep, threatening undercurrent that made my skin crawl. So, I did the only thing that made sense at the time. I made a quick decision to loop around the block. It wasn't far, and I could buy myself some time. Maybe I'd see if I could shake him off, find a way to get to my house without him noticing where I was going. As I took the turn, my mind was racing. I was thinking about all sorts of things, about how I was going to get out of this, how I was going to get home safely. I didn't know if I should call someone, but I didn't have the presence of mind to grab my phone. All I could do was ride faster, trying to outrun the fear that was steadily creeping up on me. I looped back around, my heart still pounding, and came back down the street. I slowed down as I approached the corner of my street, hoping to catch a glimpse of him and see if he had kept following me. That's when I saw him again. He was standing on my front stoop. The sight of him froze me in place. He was standing there, just staring out at the street. He wasn't looking at me directly, but it didn't matter. He was on my stoop, like he had been waiting for me, like he knew exactly where I lived. My stomach twisted, and my throat went dry. It felt like my blood had turned to ice in my veins. I kept my distance, hoping he wouldn't notice me. I could barely breathe, my mind racing with thoughts of what I should do next. I tried not to panic, tried not to give in to the feeling of complete helplessness that was creeping over me. But I couldn't shake the sense that something terrible was about to happen. I was already halfway down the street by the time I realized what had happened. He had seen me ride by again, but he didn't say anything this time. He didn't yell. It was like he knew I had figured it out, knew I was too scared to go back home now. I decided then that I wasn't going to take any chances. I turned around, riding as fast as I could back to my friend's house. I needed to be with someone, to not be alone in that moment of fear. I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't feel like I was in control. By the time I made it back to my friend's house, I was shaken, my heart still pounding in my chest. I told him what happened, and he didn't know what to say either, but I could tell he was concerned. He let me stay there the rest of the night. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. My bike had been locked up in the alleyway behind the house, out of sight. When I went out to get it, I found that it had been stolen. There was no sign of forced entry, no signs that anyone had even tried to break the lock. It was just gone. The feeling of violation, of someone creeping around where they shouldn't be, settled deep in my stomach. It wasn't just the bike, it was the whole situation. The fact that the guy had been so close, had found out where I lived, had followed me without me even realizing it. It made me sick. I didn't tell my parents right away, not at first. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But after a few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like he knew where I lived, and I couldn't shake the thought that he might come back. My mom eventually decided it was best not to involve law enforcement. She said it wasn't worth it. There were so many mentally ill people in the area that things like this happened all the time. It wasn't a reason to make a big fuss, she thought. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily he could have just followed me home that night. How, if I hadn't looped around the block, he would have known exactly where I lived. How close I had come to a situation that could have been much worse. To this day, I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully shake that feeling of unease, that feeling that someone could be out there, watching, waiting. The bike never turned up again, and I've been more cautious ever since. I'll never forget the look on that man's face when he turned around, or the feeling of dread that crept up my spine when I saw him standing on my stoop, like he knew exactly where I lived. It's a feeling I can't escape, and I don't think I ever will. It was around 2 years ago, a late summer night, and I was driving back home from a family reunion. The event had been great, but I had to leave early because I had work the next day. I was used to driving long distances, but this trip was different. The drive back home was about 2 hours, and I knew it would take me well past midnight. I didn't mind too much. It wasn't my first time making this trip. However, the roads were narrow, winding, and bordered by dense trees and bushes. The kind of road you see in horror movies, where you never know what's lurking just off to the side, hidden by the thick undergrowth. At first, the drive felt normal. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the twisted trees and dense thicket that pressed up against the edges of the road. I was starting to get a little tired, but nothing that made me overly concerned. A couple of hours behind the wheel always made me feel a bit exhausted, but I'd make it home just fine. Or so I thought. As the minutes ticked by, the exhaustion hit me like a sudden wave. One moment, I was fine, and the next, I felt my eyes growing heavy. I yawned and rubbed at my face, trying to shake off the drowsiness. It didn't work. The road stretched out before me like an endless tunnel of darkness, the trees blurring into one long, greenish mass. It was late, probably around 11:15, based on the time I'd left the reunion, and I knew I couldn't make it much further before I had to pull over. But finding a place to stop wasn't so easy. The road was narrow, and the area was so isolated. I hadn't passed any motels or rest stops for miles. The last thing I wanted was to fall asleep at the wheel, but I couldn't go on like this much longer. I needed to stop. I glanced around, looking for somewhere safe to park. There were no signs for an upcoming rest area or even a wide spot in the road. It was just me, the road, and a thick, almost suffocating forest on either side. I couldn't keep my eyes open for much longer, so I decided to do something that in hindsight probably wasn't my best decision. I pulled off to the side of the road, just enough to get my car off the asphalt, and parked. I figured I could sleep for a bit, maybe half an hour, just to get some rest before I drove the rest of the way home. I didn't want to risk pulling into some random, poorly lit parking lot, and possibly getting a visit from some creepy stranger. At least this way, I could be hidden just behind a thick patch of bushes. I wouldn't be visible from the road. I made a mental note of the time, 11:22 p.m. Then, I reclined my seat and closed my eyes, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease that lingered in the back of my mind. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep, but suddenly, I was jolted awake by a scratching sound. At first, I thought it was just some branches brushing against the car. That happened sometimes when the wind picked up, but the sound was different. It was persistent, not the usual sway of trees. It was a sharp, deliberate sound, like something was scraping against the metal of my car. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at the clock, 11:50 p.m. I hadn't been asleep for long, but that sound, that was no wind. I sat up, straining my ears to listen. The scratching stopped, but the quiet that followed only made my nerves itch. It felt wrong. Why had I been woken up by something like that? And why had it stopped so abruptly? I convinced myself it was just an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer, something harmless. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told myself to relax and went back to sleep, hoping the sound wouldn't return. But I couldn't have been asleep for more than a few minutes when I was jolted awake again. This time, the scratching wasn't just a passing noise. It was ongoing. It was louder, almost frantic. Whatever it wasn't just curious anymore. It felt like it was inspecting the car, moving around it, trying to find a way in. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:40 a.m. An hour had passed since the first time I heard the sound. I had to admit to myself that I was no longer comfortable. There was something off about this. I leaned forward to peer through the windshield, but the bushes around me were too thick to see anything clearly. My heart raced. I didn't dare open the door to check. I didn't know what was out there, but I wasn't about to find out. The thought of it being some crazy person out there made me uneasy. But then I remembered the hook killer story. The one where a couple parked on a deserted road, only for a man to come and scratch their car before attacking the guy who went out to investigate. My mind immediately flashed back to that, and the terror crept up my spine. I glanced in the rearview mirror, desperate to catch a glimpse of anything, but all I saw was darkness. Then, just as I was about to close my eyes and try to calm down, I saw it, a shadow darting through the trees. Something fast, almost inhuman in its speed. It was just a blur, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. I thought I saw something glint in the darkness, maybe a person or something else. I didn't wait to find out. I started the car, my hands shaking as I put it in gear. I didn't even glance around to check if there was anyone following me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get away from that spot as fast as possible. As I pulled away, I glanced ahead and saw a bend in the road up ahead. It was no more than 100 yards away, but something about it made me feel like I needed to hurry. I drove faster, my tires crunching on the gravel as I neared the curve. When I rounded the bend, I saw something that froze me to the bone. There, parked off to the side of the road, was a car. The driver's side door was wide open, just hanging there, like someone had left in a hurry. The car itself was dark, with only the faintest light reflecting off the windshield. I didn't see anyone standing around or anything else that stood out, but the whole scene looked wrong. It was too quiet, too still. I slowed down, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I stared, my mind raced. I didn't know if I should stop, but the decision was made for me. Just as I was about to pass, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and quick, darted around the corner of the road, sprinting toward me. My stomach turned as I realized who it was, some guy, running straight at my car. My heart pounded as he screamed at me, his voice harsh and frantic. Hey you, get the fuck out of your car. Now. The terror hit me like a wave. I didn't care why he was screaming. I wasn't stopping. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the car screeching as I sped off. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was still chasing me. I just focused on the road ahead, praying I'd get to a more populated area where I'd be safe. The miles stretched on, but I didn't slow down until I reached the nearest town. My heart was still racing. My body was trembling, and I couldn't shake the image of that guy sprinting at me. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. If I had stayed, if I had gotten out of the car, things would have gone very differently. I had no idea who he was or what his intentions were, but I wasn't about to find out. I finally made it home, exhausted and shaken. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night, not until now. To this day, I don't know what the hell was going on, but I do know one thing. Sleeping on the side of a deserted road, no matter how tired you are, is a decision you'll regret. It's not worth it. Trust me. When I was 17, freshly licensed and finally free to go wherever I wanted, I found myself drawn to one of the most reckless activities I could think of, driving around at night and exploring abandoned houses. It wasn't something that started out as a full-blown obsession. At first, it was just a way to kill time, something to do when the weekends felt endless and all the movies we wanted to see had already been watched. But soon it became a tradition. It started as a joke, something my friends and I could laugh about and talk about at school, but eventually it became an adrenaline rush. The thrill of sneaking into these empty places, the idea that maybe we'd get caught, or maybe we'd find something interesting, those moments were electric. There was one place, though, that stood out above all the others. I had passed it every time I went home from work, driving down a long stretch of road that had mostly empty fields on either side. You could tell this house was once going to be something big. The frame was massive, sitting there unfinished. A shell of a house that had never seen the life it was meant to have. It was tucked back behind some trees, a secluded spot, and I couldn't figure out why it had been left like that. There were no signs, no fences, nothing to keep people away. Just a big, broken-down structure slowly being consumed by the overgrowth. I'd gotten into the habit of driving by it almost every day on my way home from work. The place stood out to me for a lot of reasons, but most of all, it was the kind of place that just begged to be explored. My friends and I had already checked out a few rundown houses, but this one felt different. It was bigger, more isolated, and it gave off an eerie vibe, like something was wrong with it, even if it didn't look like much at first. I told my friend Jake about it one day, and as soon as I mentioned it, he was all in. Jake wasn't exactly the fearless type, but there was something about the thrill of it that caught his attention. We decided that before we went to see a movie that evening, we'd stop by and check it out. It was just about dusk when we pulled up. The orange glow of the sun was fading, and the night was creeping in, leaving the world with a sort of half-lit, hazy feeling. I flipped on my headlights as we neared the driveway and pulled right up to the front of the house. The place looked even bigger in person. The wooden beams stretched high into the air, exposed and bare. It was the kind of structure that had a feeling of abandonment, but also something more sinister, like it was waiting for something. We were only there for about 10 seconds, maybe a little more, just taking it all in. There was no real reason to stay. It wasn't like we were breaking in, or at least that wasn't our plan. We just wanted a quick peek. After a minute, I shifted into reverse and turned around, heading back to the main road. Nothing felt off at the time. It was just another trip to an abandoned house, another story to tell later. But as soon as I started pulling back onto the main road, something changed. I noticed the headlights of a truck behind us. At first, I thought nothing of it, just some guy on his way home, maybe. But then I realized how close the truck was. It was right on my bumper, so close I could barely see the front of the vehicle in my rearview mirror. I didn't think much of it, though. It's not uncommon to get tailgated at night on a quiet road, especially in a small town where everyone seems to know everyone else. I kept driving, trying not to care. But then it got worse. The truck stayed right on my tail, not backing off, not even a little bit. I checked my mirrors again, and this time, I saw the truck's high beams blindingly close, cutting through the rear window. My stomach sank a little. It was unsettling, but I didn't want to panic. Maybe it was just someone who needed to pass me. When I reached the intersection up ahead, I turned right. I figured if the truck really needed to get by, it would. But instead of turning, the truck cut through the gas station on the corner and blocked me off. That's when my heart really started to race. I stopped in the middle of the intersection, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to make the situation worse by acting like I was doing something wrong. I glanced over at Jake, who was already staring out the side window, his face pale. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was feeling the same tightness in his chest that I was. We were both way too far from home for comfort, stuck in this situation with a truck blocking us in and some random guy getting out. The man who emerged from the truck wasn't small. He was a big guy, wearing a heavy flannel shirt, jeans, and boots. He walked over to my window with a purpose, slow and deliberate. My palms were sweating. I didn't know what to expect. I could feel my mind racing, trying to come up with an excuse, a way out, something. He stopped right by my door and knocked on the window. My hands were shaking as I reached over to roll it down. "Hey," he said, his voice deep and steady. "What were you guys doing over at that house?" The question was simple, but my mind went blank. I didn't know what to say. The truth didn't seem like an option, so I went with the first thing that came to mind. "We were just making a U-turn," I blurted out, hoping it sounded convincing. He stared at us for a long moment, his face unreadable. The silence felt like it stretched on forever, thick with tension. I could feel Jake's eyes on me, waiting for some kind of sign that everything was going to be okay. I didn't know what to say or do. My mouth was dry, and my thoughts were all over the place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man gave a slow, almost deliberate smile. It wasn't the kind of smile that made me feel at ease. It was the kind of smile you'd expect from someone who knew something you didn't. He didn't say anything more. He just nodded, like he was satisfied with my answer. "All right," he said, stepping back from the car. "You can go." I didn't wait to hear anything else. I quickly rolled up the window and threw the car into drive. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pulled away, the headlights of the truck still shining behind us, but slowly fading as we made our way back down the road. We didn't speak much after that. The air in the car felt heavy, suffocating. Jake stared out the window, and I focused on the road, trying to ignore the nagging feeling at the back of my mind that something wasn't right. When we got to the movie theater, I didn't even park in the lot. I just pulled around and dropped him off without saying a word. I don't think I told him how freaked out I really was, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like we had stepped into something we shouldn't have. The next day, I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Part of me wanted to forget it, to brush it off as just some random encounter with a strange guy. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a coincidence. I knew something was off about that house, about the man who'd pulled up behind us, about the way everything had happened. A few weeks went by, and the incident started to fade from my mind. I'd passed the house again a couple of times, and I noticed something strange. There was no sign of any construction happening. The place was still sitting there, half finished, just like it had been before. But there were no workers, no trucks, nothing to indicate anyone was planning on finishing it. It was almost like it had been abandoned for a reason. Then, one day, I happened to drive by the house at night. The streetlights were dim, and the area was quiet. But as I passed by, I saw something that made my heart stop. There was a faint light inside the house. It wasn't much, just a soft glow coming from one of the upstairs windows. It didn't seem like much, but it sent a chill down my spine. I never went back to that house. I couldn't bring myself to. The feeling of unease never left me, and as much as I wanted to ignore it, I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was going on there, it wasn't something I wanted to be a part of. Maybe it was a drug operation, like I had started to suspect, or maybe it was something even darker. I never saw that man again, but the memory of that encounter stayed with me. I've thought about it many times since, especially when I'm driving late at night. The feeling of being watched, the tension in the air, the way that man had stared at us, like he knew something we didn't, that moment has never left me. To this day, the house remains unfinished, and I'm convinced there's something more to it than just an abandoned construction project. If anything, it's a reminder that some places are better left unexplored. From the time I was about 4 years old, I started having these dreams. Not the kind of silly, cartoon-like dreams little kids are supposed to have. These were nightmares. Dark, vivid, and filled with this thing that I could never really explain in words back then, but I just called him the Green Man. I don't know why he had that name in my head. I never gave it to him on purpose. It just stuck. He was tall, taller than my dad even. He always wore this long black cape that dragged behind him, and it never moved with the wind or anything. It just floated. His skin was dark green, like something rotten, and shiny in a way that reminded me of old broccoli left out too long. His eyes were long, red slits that glowed like hot wires. He had no nose, just two deep holes where one should have been, and when he smiled, if that's what you'd call it, his mouth would open impossibly wide, full of these long, sharp, thin teeth that looked like they were made to tear through something alive. Every night, I saw him in my dreams. I could be in the backyard or playing with toys in my room, and then, somehow, it would shift. The whole world in the dream would turn gray and quiet. Everything would freeze. No wind, no birds, nothing. And then I'd feel him coming. That was always the worst part, even more than seeing him. That feeling of dread, like my body knew before my mind did. I'd go ice cold. I'd freeze in the dream and try not to breathe or move. But he always found me. Always. He never ran. He never chased. He would just glide toward me real slow. His cape would float around like it was underwater. I'd try to scream or move, but my body wouldn't work in the dream. I'd just be stuck there, helpless, until he got close enough for me to feel his breath on my face. It always smelled like something dead, like trash and wet dirt. And that was when I'd wake up, sweating and shaking, sometimes screaming. My parents thought it was just a phase. They said kids get nightmares sometimes, and it was probably just something I saw on TV. But they didn't get it. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was every night for years. From 4 to maybe 7, he was always there. Then one night, I had a different dream. I don't even know how it started, but I remember it clearly. I was in my old room, not the dream version. It looked exactly like my real room, down to the wrinkles in the blanket and the toy car half under the bed. My baby brother was in his crib, just across the room. I walked over to him, and everything felt normal. But then, suddenly, the temperature dropped. I remember seeing my breath fog up in the air. That same cold feeling crept up my spine like ice water. I knew he was coming. I turned toward the doorway, and there he was, standing there, hunched over because his head nearly touched the ceiling. His red eyes were locked on my brother. He started gliding across the floor, slowly, steadily, the way he always did. But this time, I couldn't move at all, not even a twitch. I just stood there frozen, while he leaned over the crib. I couldn't see what he did. I didn't hear my brother cry or anything, just silence, then his teeth as he turned to look at me and smiled. When I woke up, I remember jumping out of bed and running to my mom. I must have told her the dream. I was crying and rambling, barely able to get the words out. She held me and said something like, "It's just a dream," but I could tell she was a little freaked out by how upset I was. A few hours later, she went to change my brother's diaper, and that's when things got weird. Inside his diaper, stuck to his leg, was one of those sticky green hand toys. The kind you get from a quarter machine at the grocery store. It was stretched out and dirty, like it had been in there for a while. Nobody had any idea where it came from. We didn't have any of those toys in the house. I was too scared to even touch stuff like that. My parents didn't know what to say. We never talked about it again. Ever. They just acted like it hadn't happened. Eventually, they decided the house was just too old and weird. It creaked all the time, the plumbing made strange noises, and lights would flicker now and then. I remember my dad saying something like, "This place is probably haunted," but in a half-joking way. Still, we moved. We got out of there. I thought that would be the end of it. We moved into a brand new house. The kind that still smelled like fresh paint and new carpet. Everything was clean, bright, and perfect. No history. No strange noises. Just silence and space. At first, it was nice. I actually slept through the night for a couple of weeks, maybe even a month. I started to feel normal. I started to forget the green man, like he was fading into the past. But then one night, I woke up in a cold sweat. My room was dark, too dark. The kind of dark that seems heavier than it should be, like something's pressing down on the walls. I looked around and felt that old, familiar chill in my bones. My skin prickled. My heart started pounding before I even realized what was happening. Then I knew he was back. The dreams came again. Slowly at first, one every few nights, then more often. Same figure, same stare, same silence. But this time, something was different. He was changing. More detailed. More present. The dream versions of my room were getting more exact, like my brain wasn't making them up anymore. They were copies. I'd wake up, sure I'd seen him standing at the edge of my bed. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps or breathing just outside my door. I'd lie there frozen, not moving an inch, just listening. After a while, I didn't need the dreams to feel him. I'd just be sitting in my room reading or playing with my toys, and suddenly I'd go cold. That fear would creep back in. I'd look at the doorway or the closet, and I'd just know he was there watching. I couldn't see him, but I felt it in every part of me. One night, I got sick. Not just a little. I had a fever that left me shaking and sweating, my head pounding like someone was knocking from inside. My mom gave me some medicine and tucked me in, but it didn't help. I couldn't sleep. My skin was burning, but I felt like I was freezing inside. I tossed and turned, then sat up and just stared at the wall, hoping the night would end. Then it hit me. That wave of terror, heavier than ever before. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't even swallow. It was like something big was coming, something worse than usual. I looked around my room. Everything looked the same. My toys, my books, the posters on the wall. But then I heard it. Look, that voice. It was deep and loud and weirdly flat, like a robot yelling through a tunnel. It shook the room. I snapped my head toward the dresser, and that's when I saw them. My two dolls, the ones that usually just sat still with their blank faces, were fighting. Arms swinging, heads jerking around like they were alive. One was choking the other, its plastic fingers tight around the neck. I just sat there, too sick and too scared to scream. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might stop. I remember blinking, and when I opened my eyes, they were just dolls again, sitting exactly where they always did. No movement, no sounds, just me, sweating and shaking under the blanket, trying not to throw up. I didn't tell anyone. I knew they wouldn't believe me. Maybe it was the fever. Maybe I imagined it. But the fear was real. The way it crawled under my skin, the way it made the room feel smaller, like the walls were pressing in on me. That was real. After that night, things didn't go back to normal, but the green man started showing up less and less. The dreams faded again, slowly, over weeks, then months. The feeling of cold terror stopped coming. I started sleeping again. I got older, started school, made friends. Life moved on, but I never forgot him. Now that I'm older, I've tried to make sense of it all. I've looked into sleep paralysis, fever dreams, night terrors, childhood trauma. Anything that could explain why my brain conjured something like that. I've read stories of other people seeing similar figures. Tall, dark, watching from the corner of the room. Maybe it's some deep-rooted fear that all kids go through. Maybe the green man was just how my young mind dealt with stress or change. Maybe moving, having a new baby in the house, feeling invisible. All that stuff mixed together and created him. That makes sense, I guess. More sense than thinking there was really something there. But that green hand in my brother's diaper? I still don't know what to think about that. We never had those toys. I never played with them. Nobody could explain how it got there. I don't dream about him anymore. I haven't for years. But sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I'll get this quick, sharp chill down my spine. It only lasts a second, but it's enough to make me open my eyes and scan the room. I never see anything. Nothing moves. Nothing speaks. But I still wait for a moment, just to be sure. It had been just a few months since we moved into the new house. My parents had it built in a quiet part of town, away from the usual noise and chaos of Kathmandu. It wasn't far from the city, but it felt isolated enough. The road outside was still partly dirt, and most of the neighboring plots were empty or under construction. There were tall, dry grasses around the boundary wall, and the evenings were usually filled with the sharp sounds of crickets and the occasional bark of a stray dog echoing from far down the street. The house itself was tall, narrow, and solid. My dad had wanted it built with thick walls and strong beams. He was proud of it. It had 3 full floors and a small room on the roof where the water tanks were. The staircase wasn't inside the house like you'd expect. Each floor had a heavy metal door that opened into the landing, and the stairs wound up along the side of the building outside those doors. So if you wanted to go from the 2nd floor to the 3rd, you had to leave 1 floor, step out into the open stairwell, and go up to the next. The lights in the stairwell were installed far apart, and the switches were placed at odd spots that didn't make much sense. At night, you had to either turn on the light from the floor you were on or go down in near darkness. Most of the time, we didn't bother with the lights. The top floor had the TV room. It was the one room in the house with carpeting. My dad had found it on sale, and he was determined to make that room cozy. There was a wide window with a narrow metal grill, and you could see the hills in the distance if the sky was clear. That night, it was just me and my younger sister upstairs watching TV. I don't remember what we were watching, probably something random. The power had come back not too long ago, and we were just happy the TV was working. We both sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, half wrapped in blankets even though it wasn't really that cold. It was around 8 in the evening when our mom called us down for dinner. I still remember that exact moment. Her voice echoed faintly from below, and we both groaned a little. Neither of us wanted to leave the warmth and the comfort of the room. But she called again, and we figured we should just get up and go before she yelled. I don't know why we didn't turn on the stairwell light. Maybe the switch on the third floor wasn't working, or maybe we were just used to walking down in the dark by then. The light from the TV room spilled out a little onto the landing when we opened the metal door, but it barely reached the stairs. We didn't even think twice about it. The both of us just stepped out and started walking down. The stairs were cold under our feet. They were concrete with rough, sandpapery texture, the kind that grits under your slippers. We walked slowly, one after the other, hands brushing the metal railing. We always kept a hand on it in case we missed a step. The air outside was still, and you could smell the wetness of the walls, like rain had fallen sometime earlier, or maybe it was just moisture collecting on the concrete. We passed the third-floor water tanks, big black plastic barrels, sitting still and silent. We were almost to the second floor. I could see the light from inside the house leaking out from under the metal door. Just a few more steps, and we'd be inside. That's when it happened. Right next to my left ear, close, so close I felt a tiny shift in the air. A voice said, "Hello." It was a child's voice. A boy, clear and sharp like he was standing right there, right beside me, not above or below, not muffled by walls or echoing from somewhere. Just a normal, clear, casual hello. It wasn't loud or whispered. Just said, right there. I didn't think. I just ran. I shoved the second floor door open so hard it hit the wall and bounced. My sister was already inside by the time I looked back, and she was pale, staring at me with wide eyes. Neither of us said anything right away. We just slammed the door shut and stood there, breathing fast, trying to make sense of it. The living room lights were on, the dining table was set, and the smell of rice and curry was hanging in the air. It felt like we had stepped into another world from the one just outside that door. My mom looked up from the kitchen and asked what was wrong. We both said nothing. We sat down at the table and tried to act normal, but my hands were shaking a little. Later, when we went to bed, I asked my sister if she had heard it too. She nodded. She had heard the same voice, the same exact hello. And she had felt it too, close, just by her ear. The weird part was this. The voice wasn't Nepali. It was English. Not just English, but the voice of a kid who spoke it natively. I had never met a foreign kid in person in Nepal. We didn't have foreign neighbors. We didn't even live near any schools with international students. I tried to tell myself maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone was hiding on the stairs, playing a joke. But how? Those stairs were narrow. We would have seen someone. There was no one there. Just empty stairs and shadows. And even if it was someone, how could they have gotten that close without a sound? I tried not to think about it too much after that. We both avoided talking about it. It just sat there in the back of our minds. A strange little memory we didn't want to deal with. But something about the house kept bothering me. The stairwell became something I avoided at night. If I had to go upstairs after dark, I'd turn on every single light I could find. I'd even open doors along the way so I could see through the glass panels and keep an eye on things. Sometimes, when I was on the second floor and the others were downstairs, I would hear soft scuffling outside, like someone moving their feet on concrete. Not heavy steps, just shifting, like someone standing still and changing their balance. I'd open the door and look, nothing. A few weeks after the hello incident, something else happened. This one was different. I woke up in the middle of the night. It wasn't from a dream. There was no sound, no sudden jolt. I just opened my eyes and was instantly alert, as if something had snapped me awake. My room was dark, but there was a little bit of moonlight coming through the curtains. I was lying on my back, which I almost never do. I usually sleep curled on my side, but that night I was flat on my back and staring up at the ceiling. I tried to move, to shift, to roll over, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. Panic didn't hit immediately. At first, I just thought I was tired. But then I noticed my breathing was too fast, too shallow. My chest felt heavy. My heart was thudding. I could move my eyes, but that was it. I looked around the room, slowly, without moving my head. The corners of the room were swallowed in shadow, but I could make out the window, the wardrobe, the faint outline of the chair in the corner. And then I saw him. There was a man standing right beside my bed, not leaning or crouching, just standing, still and tall. He wore a long brown overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. The kind of hat you'd see in old detective movies. He wasn't blurry or ghost-like. He looked solid, real, as if someone had walked right into my room in the middle of the night and just stood there watching. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't close my eyes. I stared at him, and he didn't move. Not an inch. I couldn't even see if he was breathing. He didn't reach out or speak. He just stood there, inches from my face, and watched. Time dragged. It could have been seconds or hours. I don't know. Eventually, like a rubber band snapping, I jerked forward. My limbs came back. I sat up and gasped, heart racing. The room was empty. The space beside my bed was clear. Nothing there. I turned on the light, looked everywhere, opened the cupboard, checked under the bed. I even opened my bedroom door and peered into the hallway. Nothing. That morning, I didn't tell anyone. I thought maybe I had dreamed it, but it didn't feel like a dream. I had looked right at him. I remembered every detail, the coat, the hat, the stillness, the awful thick air around me. I looked it up online later and found out about sleep paralysis. It matched what I experienced. But what scared me the most was how real it all felt. Like I wasn't dreaming at all. Like I had woken up into something I wasn't supposed to see. It never happened again. Even now, years later, I think about that night. I don't try to explain it. I just accept that it happened. The voice on the stairwell, the man in the coat, maybe they were tricks of the mind. Maybe they weren't. But they happened. I remember them as clearly as I remember any other moment in my life. The house is still there. We don't live in it anymore. My parents rented it out after we moved to a different part of the city. Every now and then, someone new moves in. They stay for a while, then they leave. No one ever says anything, but the house never keeps tenants for long. I sometimes wonder if they ever walk those stairs at night without turning on the light, or if they ever wake up in the dark and find someone standing right beside their bed watching. I'll never know. And honestly, I don't need to. Some things are better left as they are. Quiet, strange, and unanswered. The worst must have been a trip I went on a while back. People always say to avoid places that, at night with lights on, look dim. I tried my best to avoid those kinds of places, but my friends just wanted to find a place to roll in for the night. They didn't care where, just rolling in somewhere. We found a roadside motel. It had the whole big light sign with lights outside and everything. Yet for some reason, it looked dark. After parking the car, I went into the reception with one other to get the keys, 2 rooms. And for some reason, the room was dimmed as hell. All the lights were on, and all the lights were working, but I had to walk up to the front desk before I saw the details on the man's face. A mole, for example. I didn't like this one bit. I wanted out, but they said no sleeping in the car tonight, etc. So I had to comply or sleep on the street. I thought it would be better if I got into the room and just sort of set up camp and contemplated saying a prayer. Turned on the lights and bam. It was like a low-watt light or something. Hardly lit the room at all. I had more light coming from my iPod than from the room's lighting. I just sort of said something along the lines of, "I'm not changing or sleeping tonight." My friend said whatever and then went to sleep after showering. I really should have slept that night, because things just did not make sense. I heard rattling in the walls and doors opening and closing randomly. I looked outside a few times, but didn't see anyone. There were these random sounds of water, not the kind in pipes, and sometimes I just saw things. I don't know how to explain it, but I just saw things. Then my friend woke up and told me to stop talking, but I made noise by walking around, not saying anything. He muttered himself to sleep. That's when I knew something was really screwed up. I wanted light, just brighter light, and so I turned my iPod all the way up in brightness. I never do this because I know it kills the battery, but this was kind of dire. Room lights were on, television was on, laptop plugged in was on. Any source of light I could pull, I had it on. Just made sure that every inch I could cover was covered. I think I drifted off to sleep a few times, but my brain just nodded me back to consciousness. Eventually, morning came. I opened the windows and door, and just sort of gave a little cheer inside that the sun was up. My friend looked at me all weird that morning. I don't blame him. Laptop, TV, PSP phone, iPod. Everything was on and bright as hell. He must have been confused as hell, but I knew better than to explain it to him. He just wouldn't have listened. Not sure what the hell it was about that motel, but from that moment on, I always travel with some kind of good light source. I was out walking through the bush, hunting upland birds. The morning had started off just like any other. I had my shotgun slung over my shoulder, a small pack with some water, snacks, and extra shells, and I was dressed in my usual camo gear. The air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over the landscape. Birdsong filled the air, and I felt at peace, immersed in the solitude of nature. I had been walking for a couple of hours, following game trails and listening for the telltale flutter of wings. The terrain was familiar. I had hunted this area many times before. I knew where the birds tended to congregate and which paths would lead me to the best spots. As I moved through a dense thicket, I decided to take a shortcut through a small valley that would lead me to another area known for good bird activity. The valley was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of every sound. My boots crunched softly on the dry leaves, and I could hear the distant rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. As I descended into the valley, the trees grew taller and the canopy thicker, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I kept my eyes and ears open, hoping to spot some birds. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I froze. Standing about 30 yards ahead of me was a man. He was holding an AR-15 at the ready position, the barrel pointed slightly downward, but clearly prepared to be raised at a moment's notice. He was dressed in tattered clothing, layers of mismatched garments that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His face was gaunt, with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes that stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His hair was unkempt, and a scraggly beard covered his chin. He looked like he hadn't bathed in a long time. My heart began to race, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Instinctively, I knew this wasn't a place I wanted to be. I tried to stay calm, keeping my shotgun lowered and my posture non-threatening. I gave a small nod and said, "Hey, just out bird hunting. How are you doing?" He stared at me for a moment before replying, "Fine." There was a long pause, and then he added, "I'm hunting deer." His words didn't make sense. Deer season wasn't open, and AR-15s aren't legal for deer hunting. He wasn't dressed like a hunter, and his appearance suggested he had been living rough for some time. Everything about the situation felt off. I forced a smile and asked, "Do you know the best way for me to go to find some birds?" He replied, "Well, I imagine you might find some back the way you came." His voice had a sharper edge to it, and the emphasis on back the way you came was unmistakable. I took the hint. Without saying another word, I slowly turned around and began to walk back the way I had come. I kept my pace steady, not wanting to appear panicked, but every nerve in my body was on high alert. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. Once I was out of sight, I picked up my pace, moving quickly but quietly through the underbrush. I didn't stop until I was well away from the valley and back in familiar territory. I found a spot to sit and catch my breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. I replayed the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Who was that man? What was he doing out there with an AR-15? Was he hiding something? I decided to report the incident to the sheriff the next day. I provided as much detail as I could, describing the man's appearance, the location, and the encounter. The sheriff took notes and thanked me for the information, but I never heard anything more about it. I don't know if they investigated or if anything came of it. The experience left a lasting impression on me. I still go hunting, but I'm more cautious now. I stick to well-known areas and always let someone know where I'll be. That encounter reminded me that the wilderness can be unpredictable, not just because of the animals, but because of the people you might meet out there. I never saw that man again, and I hope I never do. But the memory of that day stays with me, a reminder to always be aware of my surroundings and to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. I had been working remotely for a couple of years and decided to rent a small cabin in a tiny town with a population of around 200. The cabin was nestled in the woods, close to a highway but secluded enough to offer the peace I was seeking. It was just me, my laptop, and my loyal dog. One afternoon, while walking my dog, I heard 2 gunshots nearby. Given the area's hunting culture, I didn't think much of it. A couple of days later, a man in a truck pulled up to my cabin. He introduced himself as my neighbor, though his house was out of sight, at least half a kilometer away. He asked if I had heard the gunshots and claimed his neighbor had fired at his house over a land dispute. He didn't ask me to be a witness, just if I had heard them. Then things got strange. He noticed my dog digging and suddenly tried to assert dominance over her, flipping her onto her back. She yelped, and I told him to stop. He He asked if I had any guns. I said no. He then invited me to mow his lawn, insisting I bring my dog. His mannerisms were unsettling. After he left, I realized I had told a stranger I was unarmed and had heard gunshots he claimed were aimed at his house. What if he was the one who fired the shots? He began calling and texting, persistently asking me to visit. I later learned from local store owners that he was known for his erratic behavior and had a bad reputation. Nights became tense. The cabin was isolated, and every sound felt amplified. One night, my dog started growling. I couldn't hear anything, but I locked us in the bathroom, the only room without windows, clutching a knife and bear spray. We stayed there for hours. Eventually, I decided to leave. I packed my belongings and my dog into my old van and drove away without looking back. I later found a new place in a larger town where people minded their own business. I still keep the bear spray and knife close, but my dog and I are safe now. I used to go backpacking all the time. In my late teens and early 20s, I practically lived for it. Any chance I got, I'd head out into the wilderness. Mountains, valleys, deserts, canyons, I didn't care. I just wanted to be far away from roads, streetlights, and anything that buzzed or blinked. Out there, with a pack on my back and days ahead of me, life felt quieter, simpler. I've had a lot of good trips. I've had moments of wonder, sunrises over alpine lakes, elk herds moving in silent unison through pine forests, stars thick enough to drown in. But of everything I've ever experienced out there, the thing that scared me the most, without question, was lightning. Not bears, not getting lost, not running low on food or water. Lightning. My first real encounter with it happened at Philmont, in New Mexico. It's a huge chunk of wilderness, mostly mountains and canyons, owned by the Boy Scouts. That was the kind of trip you look forward to for years. A dozen of us in a crew, packs loaded heavy, hiking day after day across rugged terrain. The sky there always seemed vast and empty, with clouds that built up quickly and vanished just as fast. The air smelled like dust and sage. We were somewhere on the northwestern side of the property, maybe halfway through our route, when it happened. That evening, the sun was still shining, angled low, casting a golden light over everything. But there were dark clouds building behind the ridgeline. We'd noticed them earlier, murmured something about maybe getting rain, but nobody thought much of it. The wind hadn't picked up yet, and it was still warm. We stopped early to set up camp, found a flat spot near a copse of thin, scraggly trees. We got our tents up, our bear bags hung, and started cooking dinner. Dinner was just some basic rehydrated stuff: rice, powdered beans, a bit of summer sausage we'd saved. It was quiet, just the sound of stoves hissing, someone laughing low under their breath. I remember how peaceful it felt. Then, without any warning, a lightning bolt hit a tree no more than 50 feet from us. There was no thunder before it, no wind kicking up, no raindrops, just a massive white-hot explosion that shattered the air and ripped that tree apart. The sound of it was so fast and violent, it was like a bomb had gone off. My ears rang. I remember feeling it in my chest like someone had punched me. Every single person jumped up and stumbled backward at the same time, some of us yelling out loud. Dinner went flying. Our pot of food tipped into the dirt. Some people dropped their spoons, others just froze. The tree cracked and split and steamed in the heat, bark stripped away in long curls. A branch, maybe 10 feet long, came crashing down and bounced once before coming to rest near one of the tents. I can still see it so clearly, the way the bark had been blown outward in jagged spirals from the trunk. I don't even know if it had started raining yet. It might have started right after. Or maybe it started while we were still standing there in shock. That strike was the closest we had that entire trip, though there were other storms. One blew in 2 nights later and pinned us in our tents for hours. Another time, we saw bolts dancing across the ridgeline in the distance, far enough away to be beautiful. But that first one stuck with me. I couldn't sleep well after that. Every night, if I saw even the smallest cloud on the horizon, I felt my pulse speed up. I kept checking the guy lines and listening for the low grumble of thunder. It planted a seed of fear in me that I've never quite shaken. But even that wasn't the scariest night I've had. That came years later, in Kings Canyon, California. We were doing the Ray Lakes Loop, a pretty famous trail that winds through the Sierra Nevadas. You start low and climb high, crystal lakes, granite peaks, wildflowers everywhere. That trip was going well. A friend and I had planned it for months. got our permits, trained a bit, and started out with good weather. We moved slow, took lots of photos, swam in the icy lakes when we could. By the 5th day, we were deep in the mountains, and everything had that silent, ancient feel to it. We reached a campsite down near a river at the bottom of a narrow valley, a place surrounded on all sides by steep granite walls. You could tell by looking at the landscape that water had shaped it. Long vertical lines etched the walls where runoff had poured during storms. The rocks around us were smooth and bare in places, evidence of powerful floods in years past. But the National Park Service had a site marked there, and it was the logical stop for the day. We didn't really have a choice. The next good site was a full day's hike away, and we were already spent. We set up camp, pitched our tents a little higher up the bank just in case, and cooked dinner on a flat slab of stone not far from the water. I remember how the air felt that evening. A little humid, not cool enough for that elevation. The wind was dead still. The clouds were high and scattered, not threatening. We turned in early, stomachs full and gear packed tight just in case. I fell asleep to the sound of the river. At some point deep in the night, everything exploded. I mean that literally. 1 second I was asleep, warm inside my sleeping bag, and the next I was awake with a scream lodged in my throat. A flash of white light had pierced my eyelids, like someone had shoved a camera flash into my face. Before I could even open my eyes, the thunder hit. It was so loud, so deep and all-consuming. I honestly thought the earth was breaking apart. I remember a split second of total confusion, like I'd been shot awake from a dream. I didn't even register it as thunder at first. It sounded like 1,000 doors slamming shut in the sky all at once, like a train was barreling over the tent. The rain started a heartbeat later. Not drizzle. Torrents. Walls of it. The noise was deafening on the tent's rainfly, a constant hammering. My tent lit up again, another flash, brighter than the last. It illuminated the entire space, everything inside cast in perfect shadow. I could see my pack's outline, my shoes, the curve of the mesh above me. And then more thunder. It didn't even come in bursts anymore. It just rolled and rolled, never ending, like a drum line with no pause. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and just lay there. I was completely alone in that moment. My friend was in the next tent over, maybe 10 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. I remember thinking, asterisk, this is it. This is how I die. Asterisk, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt certain. The lightning didn't stop. It just kept coming, flash after flash. Some of it directly overhead, some of it skimming the granite walls nearby. The thunder was so loud it made my chest vibrate. The whole tent shuddered when a particularly close strike hit. I don't even know how long it went on for. 20 minutes? An hour? Time stopped meaning anything. The inside of my tent was lit up constantly like a strobe light, and the forest around us looked like a stage in a haunted play, lit in white, flickering between strikes. I started worrying about the river. The storm was so intense, and we were in a narrow valley. I tried to convince myself that the Park Service wouldn't put a campsite in a known flood zone, but that logic felt thin. The ground was saturated, and water had begun to pool beneath the floor of my tent. I could feel it squish beneath the pad. I imagined a wall of water coming down from upstream, crashing over the banks and sweeping everything. Me, the tent, my gear, into the rocks. I thought about climbing the valley walls, but in that storm, I'd be a lightning rod, and there was no shelter up there. Just slabs of granite and loose scree. All I could do was wait. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. I don't remember the storm ending. I just remember waking up at dawn, the air cool and wet, the tent still standing. Everything inside was damp, but not soaked. Outside, the world was eerily calm. The river hadn't risen much, maybe just a few inches. My friend and I made eye contact while silently packing up. We didn't talk until we'd climbed out of the valley. That was the worst of it, but not the last. A couple of years later, I was hiking in Switzerland. I'd always wanted to see the Alps, and I saved up for months for that trip. The scenery was unlike anything else. Massive peaks, green pastures, wildflowers everywhere. But it's also unpredictable weather-wise. On our way down from a high pass one day, we got caught in the open during another lightning storm. We were in a huge, bowl-shaped alpine meadow. Just bare rock and short grass, no trees, no buildings, no boulders big enough to hide behind. The storm rolled in fast. We heard thunder in the distance and thought we had time to descend, but within minutes the sky went from pale blue to steel gray. Then came the wind, then the flashes. There was no place to go, just open ground in every direction. We dropped our packs and squatted low, trying to make ourselves small. You're supposed to keep your feet together, hands off the ground, minimize contact. I remember the cold seeping into my legs, the rocks biting into my boots. I remember the way each flash seemed to freeze the world for a second, followed almost immediately by thunder so sharp it felt like someone was snapping a tree behind my head. One strike hit the far end of the meadow and threw up a puff of white smoke. Another hit somewhere behind us, and the echo bounced between peaks like cannon fire. We stayed like that for who knows how long. 30 minutes, an hour. It felt like forever. By the time it passed, my thighs were trembling from the squat, and my hands were numb from gripping my knees so hard. We didn't say a word until we reached a hut several miles down. When we finally got inside, sat down, and felt the heat from the fireplace, I almost cried. After that, something changed in me. I still love the mountains. I still go out. But if I hear thunder now, even distant, even faint, I stop whatever I'm doing. I check the sky. I pull up the weather. I don't care. I was 13 when I went on that week-long camping trip with the Boy Scouts. It was my third summer with the troop, and I'd started to feel more comfortable with the whole setup, pitching tents, making campfires, tying knots, cooking over coals, and earning merit badges. That summer I was working on the Wilderness Survival Badge, which sounded fun on paper, but ended up making me more anxious than I expected. One of the key requirements was to build a makeshift shelter using only what you could find or bring in your pack, and to sleep in it alone or in small groups away from the main campsite. It was supposed to simulate a survival situation, like you were lost in the woods and had to fend for yourself. There were about 8 of us boys who were doing the same merit badge. A few were older than me, a few younger. I knew most of them pretty well. We'd all been on multiple trips together, so we'd gotten used to each other's personalities, who complained a lot, who snored, who liked to mess around too much. I wasn't really close to any of them, though. I kept to myself more than the others did. I wasn't the loud, outgoing type. I was the one who followed instructions, kept things quiet, and tried not to stand out. The survival night was scheduled for Thursday. We'd spent the first few days doing hikes, taking swimming tests in the lake, and sitting through long merit badge classes under big white canopies. That part of the week had already worn me down, mostly because I never slept well in new places. The woods were loud at night in a different way than home. Crickets, frogs, wind in the trees, the occasional rustle that set off a chain reaction in my imagination. I kept waking up from every little sound, and every time I did, it took me forever to fall back asleep. So by the time Thursday rolled around, I was already running on edge. During lunch that day, the camp counselor in charge of the Wilderness Survival Badge met us by the dining pavilion to go over the rules again. We had to carry only what we could fit in our day packs. No tents, no sleeping bags, no matches, just a tarp or poncho, some paracord, a small first aid kit, and a knife if we had one. We'd been practicing making shelters all week using branches and leaves and tying them off between trees. I'd been nervous about that part, but when I saw how basic the other guys' shelters looked, I felt better. We were all kind of winging it. That afternoon, after collecting our gear, we hiked about 2 miles into the woods. The troop had gotten permission from the camp to use a more remote part of the forest for our shelters. There was a narrow dirt path leading off the main trail, and we followed it through thick undergrowth, across a shallow creek, and finally into a wide clearing ringed with tall pine trees. That was our spot. The adult leader walked us in, reminded us not to wander off alone at night, and pointed out where the emergency whistle was hanging from a tree in case something went wrong. Then he left. We spread out, each kid picking a small patch of space near the edge of the clearing to start building. Some of the guys teamed up to make joint shelters, which was allowed as long as you didn't use a tent. I worked on mine alone. I found a small rise in the land with 2 trees spaced about 6 feet apart, perfect for stringing my paracord. I draped my tarp over it like a lean-to and used pine branches to weigh it down and add some extra insulation. The ground was soft with old needles, and I made a shallow dip to lie in, hoping it would keep me warm. It wasn't the best shelter, but it felt safe enough. I could see 3 other boys' shelters from where I was, just shapes and outlines between the trees. We were spaced apart, but not far enough that you'd feel completely isolated. That helped a little. The sun went down quick. In the woods, the light disappears faster because of how thick the canopy is. And before I knew it, we were in that deep bluish dusk where you can't tell how late it is, only that you should be settled in. A few of the boys tried starting small fires in their rock circles, but most of them fizzled out pretty fast. We weren't allowed to bring lighters or matches. I didn't even try. I just crawled into my shelter, pulled my emergency blanket over myself, and lay still. At first it wasn't too bad. I could still hear a few voices in the distance, laughing, someone making fun of someone else's shelter, another guy trying to scare the others by pretending to be a bear. I closed my eyes and breathed slow, just trying to settle my heart. But even after everyone quieted down, I couldn't sleep. The air felt damp and cool. Every time I adjusted myself, the rustle of my emergency blanket sounded too loud. I kept replaying every scenario in my head. What if it rained? What if an animal came? What if I had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and got lost coming back? I just couldn't shut my brain off. I don't know how long I lay there. Maybe a couple hours. I wasn't wearing a watch, and I didn't have my phone. But sometime after midnight, I think, I was just starting to drift when I heard it. From one of the shelters maybe 50 feet away. Close enough to hear clearly, but far enough that I couldn't see who it was, I heard a voice. "No, please. Get away. Stop. Don't." Then silence. I froze. My whole body locked up. It wasn't the kind of yell someone does to mess around or to scare people. It sounded desperate. Real. It sounded like someone was being attacked or dragged away. I felt like my blood had turned cold. My hands were shaking before I even sat up. I pushed my upper body up on one elbow and just stared into the darkness in the direction of the voice. Nothing moved. Nothing else followed. I waited for someone to say something, to react, to call out. But no one did. In a whisper shout, I called out, "Hey," just once. My voice cracked a little, and it barely traveled. No answer. No noise. My heart pounded against my ribs. I thought about getting out of my shelter, walking over, checking on whoever it was. But I couldn't move. I just kept staring. I felt stupid for not doing anything, but I also felt terrified. My brain jumped to the worst possible explanations. What if there was someone in the woods? What if someone got hurt? What if it was a bear or some other animal? What if the adult leader had to come back, and someone was gone? But nothing happened. After about 5 minutes, when my heartbeat slowed enough for me to think straight again, I started replaying what I'd heard. The way the voice sounded, the tone, the choice of words, the sudden stop. I knew it wasn't real. I mean, it was real. I definitely heard it, but it wasn't someone being attacked. It was someone sleep-talking. A night terror. That had to be it. I've heard of people yelling in their sleep before. My younger brother used to do it when he was little. He'd scream and cry, and not even remember it the next day. It sounded just like that, panicked, like they were seeing something horrible. That's what I told myself. That's how I calmed down enough to lay back down. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, though. I just lay there, staring at the dark top of my tarp, listening to every noise, wondering how I could be the only one who heard it. The next morning, the sun came up slow and pale through the trees, casting long beams of light through the fog. I crawled out of my shelter, stiff and cold. My legs were sore from not moving all night, and my mouth felt dry like I hadn't drunk water in days. One by one, the other boys started emerging from their shelters, yawning, stretching, brushing off pine needles. Some complained about how cold it got. One guy said a raccoon tried to get into his backpack. Another joked about eating bugs in his sleep. But no one said anything about yelling. No one brought up the voice in the night. I kept looking around, trying to guess who it might have been. I even watched their faces, hoping someone would act weird or embarrassed. But everyone seemed normal, just tired and ready to get back to the main camp. We hiked back that morning, and the adult leader was waiting for us at the trailhead. He asked how the night went, if we all stayed dry, if anyone needed first aid. The group gave a few jokes and half-hearted answers, and that was it. It was like it never happened. For the rest of the trip, I didn't bring it up. I figured if it had been me, I wouldn't want people talking about it either. I didn't want to be the weird kid who made a big deal out of a bad dream. But inside, I kept thinking about it, over and over. The voice, the way it cut off, the fact that no one else even stirred. It's been years since that trip. I'm older now, and I've gone camping dozens of times since then. I've spent nights in places way more remote than that forest, in colder weather, with stranger animals nearby. I've been fine. I even earned the Wilderness Survival Badge, and a bunch of others after that. But that night still sticks with me. Not because I was scared, although I was. Not even because someone had a night terror. It's because I was the only one who heard it. Out of all those boys lying in the dark woods, spread out in their little homemade shelters, I was the only one who woke up to that voice. I know it happened. I didn't imagine it. I wasn't dreaming. I remember every word, every pause, every second that followed. I remember staring into the blackness, straining to hear something else, thinking maybe someone was hurt or in danger. And then nothing. I've thought about it a lot since then. Maybe it really was a sleep disorder. Maybe the kid who yelled forgot it even happened. Maybe he woke up the next morning and didn't remember a thing. But what I still can't wrap my head around is how no one else woke up. 8 of us sleeping out in the woods with no walls, no tents, just thin blankets and tarps between us and the world. Sound travels fast out there. It doesn't get muffled like it does in houses or buildings. You hear everything. A squirrel in the brush sounds like footsteps. A twig snapping can make you flinch. So how did no one else stir? I don't have an answer, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is that I laid awake until the sun came up, eyes wide, heart thudding, waiting for another voice that never came. And when morning finally arrived, and the others... It was my first time in Guatemala. My girlfriend and I had planned the trip months in advance. We both wanted to get away from city life for a while, away from the phones, the noise, the same people, the stress. We had been saving for this for a while, choosing something remote, wild, and completely different from what we were used to. We picked the Petén region in the north, with its endless rainforest, ancient ruins, and barely used jungle trails. The crown jewel of it all was Tikal, a massive Mayan city swallowed up by the jungle and only partly unearthed. Some tourists take the bus straight to it, but we wanted to walk there. There's a 3-day hike through the jungle that not many people do. We figured it would be a kind of test for us. 3 days through hot, humid jungle. No roads, no lights, barely any signal, just dirt trails, trees, howler monkeys, and the sound of our own breath. We set out with only what we could carry: food, water, our packs, a small tent, some supplies, a camping stove, a knife, the basics. We hired a local guide who took us to the edge of the trail, gave us directions, and pointed out markers we needed to follow. There were ranger stations, he said, tiny clearings deep in the woods where we could set up our tent safely, with rainwater collection tanks and sometimes a roof or shelter. It sounded fine on paper. The real thing was a little more serious. The first day was long. The heat soaked through our clothes, and the air was so thick you felt like you were swimming through it. Every few minutes, I was swatting away mosquitoes, and we kept reapplying repellent that barely worked. The trail narrowed quickly, and vines and thick leaves slapped at our legs. The sounds of the jungle were constant: birds calling, insects buzzing, strange rustling. We stopped once or twice for snacks and water, kept track of our progress with a GPS app we downloaded offline, and by late afternoon, we reached the first ranger camp. It was just a small clearing. There was a wooden shack that looked mostly abandoned, a big blue water barrel with a spout, and a few cement blocks with a tin roof strung between 2 trees. No one else was around. We pitched our tent under the roof, ate some canned beans and rice with tortillas, and tried to sleep. That night the jungle got louder. The howler monkeys started up around 3 a.m., and the deep guttural sound they made echoed like a horror movie. At first, I thought it was jaguars. That's how unsettling it sounded. But we knew they were monkeys, just very loud and close. The tent felt thin, like a toy shelter in a wild place that didn't care we were there. I barely slept. My girlfriend stirred often, twisting in the sleeping bag beside me, murmuring under her breath. The sweat clung to my back. Even with the tent mesh unzipped and the outer flap tied open, there was barely any breeze. We made it through that first night and kept hiking early the next morning. The second day was more rugged. The trail got steeper in parts, wetter in others. At one point, we had to cross a swampy section on old logs laid across muddy water. I slipped and went in up to my shin, and the stink followed me the rest of the day. We saw a few spider monkeys, watched a toucan flutter through a break in the trees, and found fresh jaguar tracks in the mud. We weren't stupid enough to follow them, but they made us move a little quicker. That night, we reached the second ranger camp. Again, just a small patch of cleared jungle with a water tank and a tin roof strung between trees. There was no shack this time, just a few logs set out like benches and a rusted-out barrel, that looked like someone once used it as a fire pit. It was just us out there. We hadn't seen another person since the first day, and the jungle felt bigger than anything I'd ever been inside before. We set up the tent, filtered water, and ate again, this time some instant noodles and dried mango. Around 7:30 or 8 p.m., I noticed the sky starting to change. What had been a soft sunset through the leaves turned dark, then darker. The clouds weren't the kind you just see. They moved like waves, rolling fast and heavy. I heard the first thunder rumble a little after we zipped the tent up. It was still far, but it didn't sound small. By 9 p.m., the wind had started. The trees swayed and creaked. Leaves and small branches were falling around us. Rain tapped the tent in soft bursts, then steadied into a hard drumbeat. I lay there beside my girlfriend, listening to the wind build. We had checked the forecast before leaving. Clear skies all 3 days. But the jungle didn't seem to care. Thunder cracked again, closer this time. Then again, so loud it rattled in my chest. I could feel it through the ground. The storm came down hard after midnight. I was still awake. Rain pounded against the roof of the tent like fists. Water started pooling around the edges of the floor. The tent held, but barely. It shifted and flexed with each gust of wind. I started wondering what would happen if a tree came down. We were surrounded by them, massive ceiba trees, palms, and ones I didn't recognize. Sometime around 4 a.m., I started hearing voices. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I had drifted in and out of sleep. But the voices were real, male voices low, speaking fast in Spanish. They weren't close, not yet. I sat up slowly, confused. I thought maybe it was rangers, or maybe hikers who got turned around. But something about it felt off, too early, too remote. Who else would be this deep in the jungle, hours from any road? I told my girlfriend to stay in the tent. I unzipped the door slowly and stepped outside barefoot, the ground cold and soaked beneath me. My shirt was already damp with sweat and rain. I grabbed our flashlight and scanned the trees. The voices were clearer now, 2 of them, maybe 3. I turned off the light and waited. A few seconds later, 2 men appeared on the trail. They were maybe in their 40s, rough-looking, clothes soaked, rifles slung across their backs. I froze. They saw me and raised their hands. No sudden moves. They didn't seem aggressive, just soaked and tired. One pointed up toward the sky, storm. I got the idea. They were looking for shelter. Local hunters probably, stuck out when the storm rolled in. I nodded, tried to stay calm, and stepped aside a bit so they could come under the roof. I didn't know if it was safe, but I didn't want to leave them in the storm either. My girlfriend had ignored me and stepped out of the tent a minute later, her face tense, hair wet, holding our little camping knife. She stood beside me silently. I wanted to be annoyed, but also, I was glad she wasn't in the tent. We made coffee using our small stove. They watched carefully as I heated the water, then accepted the cups with wide eyes and thank you gestures. They looked exhausted. We didn't talk much. I don't speak much Spanish, and they didn't speak any English. We all just sat there under the little roof, rain thundering all around us. The wind howling like the forest was trying to scream. Then it happened. A crack of thunder exploded directly above us, louder than anything yet. It was so sudden, so violent, it felt like something had snapped in my head. Almost immediately after, I heard a massive crack, a different one. Wood. Something giving way. A second later, the ground shook beneath us. I didn't even have time to move. A tree came down, one of the big ones. It crashed so hard I thought the earth split open. Leaves and branches exploded everywhere, a cloud of green and bark and dust. The sound it made was like the sky had fallen. I turned and I saw it. It had crushed our tent. The entire trunk, easily 5 feet thick, had slammed straight through it, like it was made of paper. The aluminum poles bent and split. The floor of the tent was flattened against the mud, fabric torn apart, our gear half buried beneath the weight. The exact spot where we'd been sleeping minutes earlier was gone. We just stared. No one spoke. If I hadn't gotten up to check the voices, if my girlfriend had listened and stayed in the tent, we'd both be dead. No question. That tree had come down like a missile. It didn't give a warning. It just fell. The hunters helped us pull back some branches and debris, but there was no saving anything. Our sleeping bags were soaked, torn. Our packs had been hit. One of the stove legs bent beyond repair. Clothes and food were soaked through. One of my hiking boots was trapped under the trunk and too deep to reach. The only things we had on us were the clothes we were wearing, the flashlights, and 2 cups of coffee still steaming in our hands. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. None of us did. We sat in silence, huddled under that tin roof with the wind shrieking and the rain pouring sideways. Lightning flashed every few seconds, lighting up the jungle like daylight. The smell of torn wood, soaked dirt, and crushed leaves filled the air. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The hunters left, vanishing into the trees with a quick wave. We never saw them again. We stayed behind, trying to gather what was left. My girlfriend didn't say anything for a long time. I didn't either. I think we were both just running through the what if in our heads over and over again. That hike to Tikal changed after that. We were no longer in awe of the jungle. We respected it, feared it. Every gust of wind after that made us look up. Every creak of a branch made us stop. We finished the hike the next day, walking slow, damp, and tired. When we finally saw the ruins of Tikal rising out of the trees, it felt like a hallucination. Giant stone temples lost in green silence. The place was beautiful, surreal. But all I could think of was how close we'd come to never seeing it. One decision, me stepping outside the tent because of some voices, saved our lives. Or maybe it was luck. Or instinct. I don't know. But I do know this. The jungle doesn't care if you're careful. It doesn't care if you came prepared. Out there, nature makes the rules. And if you forget that, even for a second, it'll remind you. The basement of the house I grew up in always made me feel uneasy. Not in the playful, spooky kind of way, but in a way that settled into the pit of my stomach whenever I had to go down there alone. It wasn't dark or filthy like you'd expect a creepy basement to be. In fact, my parents had done a decent job finishing it. The walls were drywalled and painted a soft beige. The floor was carpeted with a thick brown rug, and there were a couple of old lamps that lit the place up better than you'd expect for a basement. But no matter how normal it looked, I never liked going down there unless someone else was with me. The layout of the basement probably had something to do with how off it felt. When you came down the stairs, you immediately stepped into the main living area. There were two older couches positioned across from each other, forming a rectangle with a low coffee table in the middle. Against the far wall was a big, heavy TV that my dad had insisted we keep down there instead of upgrading it. The room itself was shaped like an L, wrapping around the stairwell, and the longer part of the L led into a little kitchen nook. You could still see the kitchen nook from the couches if you were sitting just right or leaned over the armrest, but it was just far enough around the corner that most of it was out of view. The kitchen nook had a small counter, a microwave, an old mini-fridge, and a stainless steel sink with a tiny mirror hanging just above it. That mirror didn't seem important when I was younger, but I noticed it more as I got older. It was scratched, a little foggy, and always seemed to have water spots no matter how often we wiped it down. Above the mirror was one of the two windows in the basement. Both were narrow, horizontal slits just under the ceiling, letting in thin strips of grayish daylight when the sun was just right. Most of the time they didn't do much, especially at night. When I was about 15, my best friend Catikins, who most people just called Cat, came over to spend the night. We'd known each other since 3rd grade, and she was one of the only people who liked scary stuff as much as I did. That night we decided to binge watch a show called Harper's Island. It was one of those murder mystery dramas, the kind where characters disappear one by one and nobody trusts each other. It wasn't terrifying or anything, but it had enough suspense to keep us watching. We brought snacks down, popcorn, candy, soda, and set ourselves up on the basement couches with blankets and pillows. The lights were off except for the glow from the TV and a small lamp near the stairs. It was late, probably close to 1 in the morning, and we were about 5 episodes in. We had gotten comfortable in that slightly uncomfortable way where you know you're going to regret not sleeping, but you keep watching anyway. At one point, we realized the popcorn bowl was empty, and I got up to make more. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stood, stretched a little, and walked the short distance across the carpet toward the kitchen nook. I was probably 5 steps from the stairs when I turned my head, not all the way, just slightly, to glance toward the kitchen area. I don't even remember why I looked. There wasn't a noise, and I wasn't expecting to see anything. Maybe I was just trying to orient myself in the dark, or maybe it was just habit. Either way, I looked, and I saw something move in the mirror. Not just a flicker or a blur from the corner of my eye. It was a shadow, dark and defined, moving slowly across the mirror above the sink. My brain tried to make sense of it at first. Maybe it was a trick of the light, Maybe it was my own shadow. But then I realized a couple of things in quick succession. First, I was standing still when I saw it. I had already stopped walking. Second, the shadow was moving in the opposite direction from where I'd come. It slid from left to right, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking past the mirror. Only there was no one in the kitchen nook. There was no one else in the house. My parents were gone for the weekend, visiting my aunt in another state. My younger brother was staying with a friend. Kat and I were completely alone. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, staring. The shadow had passed fully out of sight after a few seconds, but I couldn't get the image out of my mind. It hadn't looked like a trick of the light. It looked solid, like someone was really there. I turned back to the couch and saw that Kat was staring at me. She hadn't moved, but her eyes were wide and her body was rigid, like she was frozen. I could tell just by looking at her that she'd seen it too. We didn't say anything to each other. I didn't make the popcorn. We just walked up the stairs and went to my room. We didn't run or scream or even talk. We just left. That night, neither of us slept well. I remember lying on my bed with the door shut and a small lamp on, staring at the ceiling. My heart was racing, and my mind kept replaying that moment, over and over, the shadow moving across the mirror. I kept telling myself it had to be something simple, maybe something outside. Maybe a car passed by and the light bent just right through the narrow window. But I knew how little light came through those windows, and besides, the shadow had been too clear, too shaped, and too slow. For weeks after that night, we didn't bring it up. I think both of us were trying to pretend it hadn't happened. We went on with our lives, school, homework, hanging out. But I noticed that neither of us volunteered to hang out in the basement anymore. When we had sleepovers, we stayed in my room or the living room. I avoided going downstairs if I could help it. When I had to go down for laundry or to grab something, I did it quickly, always keeping my back to the walls, and I never looked toward the mirror. Eventually, we talked about it. Not in a big, dramatic conversation, just a quiet moment on my back porch one afternoon when the weather was warm and the air smelled like cut grass. I don't even remember who brought it up first, but once we did, it all came out. Kat had seen the exact same thing, a shadow moving across the mirror in the wrong direction. She'd watched it happen and had felt the same cold fear I had. She hadn't said anything that night because she didn't want to scare me, and I hadn't said anything because I didn't want to scare her. Neither of us had an explanation. Even now, years later, I still don't have one. I've gone over that night in my head more times than I can count. I've thought about reflections, lights, shadows, angles. I've walked through the basement during the day and tried to recreate what I saw. I've tried standing in the kitchen nook, walking around it, seeing what casts what kind of reflection. Nothing lines up. The only way that shadow could have appeared the way it did was if someone, something, was physically standing there and walking past the mirror. But there was no one there. I wish I could say that was the only time something strange happened in that house. But it wasn't. I'd always felt off about that basement. Sometimes I'd be down there doing homework or folding laundry and feel like I was being watched. Other times, I'd hear soft noises, creaks, light thuds, that didn't seem to come from the floor above or the furnace. I once heard what sounded like breathing behind me when I was sitting on the couch, but when I turned around, nothing was there. I told myself it was my imagination, the way old houses settle and shift, the way silence plays tricks on your mind. But after that night with the mirror, it got harder to brush things off. My parents never said they noticed anything strange, but they also didn't spend much time in the basement. It was mostly used for storage, laundry, and the occasional movie night. They had no reason to think anything was wrong, and I never told them. Not about the mirror, not about the feeling of being watched, not about the weird noises. I figured they'd chalk it up to teenage imagination, or worse, start making jokes about it. When I eventually moved out for college, I left that basement behind without much ceremony. I didn't think I'd ever need to deal with it again. But during my sophomore year, I came home for a weekend visit. My parents were renovating the upstairs bathroom and had moved a bunch of boxes into the living room. They asked if I could sleep in the basement that night to help free up space. I didn't want to. Every instinct in me screamed against it. But I didn't want to seem irrational, either. It had been a few years. I told myself I was older now, more logical, less prone to fear. I agreed. I set up a cot on one of the couches, brought down a pillow and blanket, and turned on a floor lamp near the stairs. My parents went to bed around 10. I tried reading a book to take my mind off things. The basement felt the same, musty, still, quiet. But the air was heavier than I remembered. Around midnight, I turned off the lamp and tried to sleep. I faced away from the kitchen nook, of course. I didn't want to see the mirror. I lay there for what felt like hours, tossing and turning, heart thudding for no good reason. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. But that familiar, uncomfortable feeling crept back into my chest. Like someone was standing in the kitchen nook, just around the corner, watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the first gray light started to seep in through the narrow windows, I got up and went upstairs. I told my parents I barely slept and asked if I could crash on the floor in their room the next night. They said sure, without asking questions. That was the last time I spent the night in that basement. Eventually, my parents sold the house and moved into a smaller place after I graduated. I never went back into the basement during the packing process. I helped box up the upstairs, helped load the truck, and said goodbye from the porch. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that mirror. It's been years now, and I still think about it more than I should. Kat and I are still friends, and sometimes we talk about that night in passing, like it was just a weird thing that happened when we were kids. But deep down, I know we both wonder about it more than we let on. Whatever it was, it felt real. It looked real. And it left something behind, not in the basement, but in me. A sense that not everything can be explained away by logic. Sometimes things just happen. Sometimes you see something move in a mirror when there's no one there.